It's like you really are your only comparison group, especially as you get older, because your life is so idiosyncratic and peculiar. I mean, look, you have to care what other people think. It's stupid to think otherwise, because you have to be social and you have to be aware of what other people are doing and all of that. So this isn't psychopathic individuality, but it is genuinely true that no one has your set of opportunities and limitations. And so the comparison just isn't real. It can't be sufficiently multidimensional. I've met many people who are very, very rich, and you can look at their lives and they have these huge houses and material plenty, and they're shielded from many catastrophes that would hit someone without those resources harder. But their lives are still full of exactly the same troubles that characterize human life in general. And so you compare yourself on one dimension. You don't see, well, the person's worked 80 hours a week for 40 years and it's blown all his relationships out of the water. It's like, yes, he's rich, but he's also old now. And one of the best predictors of wealth is age. You know, really, do you want to be young and poor or old and rich? It's like, I'd pick young and poor, because you can't buy youth. And that's something that's worth considering. But you don't know what burdens the people you're jealous of. So leave it be. It's not helpful to you to be envious.
Need motivation?
Watch it opt-in with Believe Nation.
Hey, it's Evan Carmichael, and I make these videos because you are probably the most ambitious person in your circle.
But you know you're capable of more. And you get that push by surrounding yourself with the best.
So today, let's learn from one of the best, Jordan Peterson, and my take on his top 50 rules of success. Enjoy.
If you know what you want, then you know when you're failing. If you don't allow yourself to know what you want, you can keep that foggy. If you don't set out the conditions for your success, then you can avoid your responsibility, because again, that's not clear. And the problem with wanting something is that in all probability, you're going to have to work for it. You're going to have to make sacrifices. And it's certainly possible that you want to avoid that. You might be afraid to make it clear because other people could deny it to you too, which is something I write about a fair bit in that chapter. The problem is, and failing to make any of that clear protects you right now, but it's really hard on you over the medium to long term, because if you don't make it clear to yourself what you want or to other people, the probability that you're just going to stumble into it is pretty low. And you can put that off indefinitely day after day, but the problem with that is that you age while you're doing that, and there's obviously a price to be paid for that. So that chapter, that's chapter 3, do not hide things in the fog. I mean, it's a warning about failing to pay attention. You know, knowledge emerges in a very strange way. It emerges, obviously, when we learn something, we started out by not knowing it. And so what that means is that knowledge goes through a transformation process from being absolutely not there to being explicit and fully detailed. And one step of that process is emotion. And so, for example, you might find yourself frustrated and disappointed about the events of the day, but be unable to exactly specify why. That's extremely common. You know, you go home to your partner and you be in a bad mood, and, you know, you'll snap at them for something and they'll say, well, what's up with you? And you'll say, well, nothing, you're just being annoying, when it's perfectly clear to both of you that there is actually something up with you. And then that disappointment and frustration, anger and sadness, let's say, or anxiety, is a sign that something isn't right. But it isn't necessarily that you're repressing knowledge of what's not right. It's that you actually don't know. And the emotion is the first step in the process by which that knowledge emerges. And you might have to sit and think and talk to your partner or to a friend for God only knows how long before you're actually going to put your finger on what it is that you're upset about. And it could be very far removed from whatever happened to trigger you in the moment. And so that's the fog. And you can keep things in the fog just by not doing that. It's really easy. It's no more difficult than just sitting there doing nothing, because creating knowledge is active and difficult. The best advice that you can really give to people who are young is that unless you have very good reason not to, you should do what all people have always done. And so what does that mean? When I see my clinical clients, although I'm not practicing anymore, when I saw my clinical clients, I would evaluate their lives across a number of dimensions. Were they immersed in a network of friendships? Did they have a family? And that could be their family of birth, but also the family that they've produced, their own husband or wife and children, if they were of an age where that was appropriate. Did they have a career or at least a job? And was their job productive and matched well with their abilities and their ambitions? Were they educated to the extent that their intelligence and curiosity might demand? Were they in reasonable physical and mental health, independent of those other areas? All of those things need to be established, and you don't want to question them so much that you don't establish them. You might think of yourself as a rebel and someone who's particularly unique, and it's also possible that you are unique in one or more ways, but fundamentally speaking, if you don't do what everyone else does, then the probability that you're abdicating your responsibility and that you will miss out on something important is extremely high. So, our culture, virtually every movie that's made for children now, you see this coming out of the Disney studios constantly, always concentrates on the special child who's got abilities that no other child has and is being crushed by society into being, unpleasantly normal. And there is a fair bit of crushing that goes along with being socialized, because part of being socialized is to become like everyone else. But you don't want to underestimate the benefit of that. It's very, very difficult to tread your own path, and you're only going to be able to do that in a limited number of areas. You blow apart the social routines, you'll find yourself out there in a domain of chaos that will overwhelm you, and that's not pleasant. You do not want that. With regards to your goals, let's say you don't know what to do. Well, maybe you're high in openness, and so you're pulled in all sorts of directions, or maybe you're low in conscientiousness, or you're confused because you're anxious, or you haven't had any direction, you haven't had good mentoring, et cetera, et cetera. There's lots of reasons. Well, I would say, pick something, right? Pick something, a nameable goal, and then try to implement it. And what'll happen is you'll learn a lot by trying to implement it. And one of the things you might learn is what a slightly better goal might be. Because if you try something diligently and you succeed or you fail, you're going to learn from the effort expended in the detailed implementation of the goal. Is going to inform you. It'll also transform you physiologically. It does that at a very basic level, neurophysiological level. You will be slightly different as a consequence of the attempt. And what that'll mean is that the next goal you pick will be a little more suited to you. And so it's this kind of pathway, right? It's like maybe the goal you should be attaining is here, but you don't know that because you're clueless. And so you aim there. Well, it's better than there. And it's not nothing. It's not cessation of movement. And, if you're supposed to go there and you go here, but you walk diligently towards it, you're a little closer once you get to here than you were here. And it's this oscillating self-corrective process that leads you to the final star. And you have to be willing to engage in erroneous experimentation to manage that, but it is a self-correcting process. And so one of the things I always talk to my clients about is, well, let's try something, and we'll reserve to ourselves the right to alter our trajectory. And then I would use as a corrective there, because you might say, well, how do you know when you're not just giving up, right? Instead of thinking maybe you need a different goal. And I would say, well, you can, if you're really concerned about your proclivity for self-deception, you can enter into a contract with yourself that you won't replace any goal you've set with a goal that's easier. And so you can switch your goal, but it has to be a little harder so that you check yourself against that tendency to withdraw and avoid and be self-deceptive. And that works like a charm. And if you do that with some degree of diligence, your goals will get better and more attainable, and you'll get happier too, because you don't experience happiness except in relationship to a goal. And that's really worth knowing. And that's another thing to think about too. If your life is meaningless, well, you're not pursuing a valued goal. I mean, you might be depressed too, and sometimes that can be like an illness, something that is really wrong with you. But a good rule of thumb is that if you find no joy in life, there's a very low probability that you're pursuing a goal that you regard intrinsically, like in the depths of your temperament, as worthwhile. And that's technically true because we do, in fact, experience most of the positive emotion, let's say, that's associated with emotions like joy. We experience that in relationship to a goal. So, well, then you want to find a goal that regulates your negative emotion and that brings you a certain amount of positive emotion and that expands your competence as you pursue it. And you will experience that as meaningful. That's really what meaning signals. Meaning signals you're doing all those things. You say, well, that's not real. It's like, don't listen to the semantic chatterbox so much, right? There's levels of you that are far wiser than that. And you can watch what happens to you instead of noticing what you think.
Also, to make sure you're actually taking action after watching this video, I've designed a special free worksheet just for this video. The worksheet will highlight all of the lessons learned in this video, as well as pull out our 3 favorite learnings and quotes that will inspire you to actually do something. The worksheet will also give you space to write down what your key takeaways are and your specific plan of action to make sure you're getting results. If you want the worksheet designed specifically for this video, absolutely for free, there's a link in the description below. Go click on it and start building the momentum in your life and your business. I'll see you there.
If the goal of life is to live a life which in retrospect we are glad that we lived, it's important to give ourselves perspective, to develop that metacognizance, to step away from the urgent, to step away from the phenomenological day-to-day existence, because the present self is a petulant child. It's lazy and it wants the path of least resistance and that glass of wine and that new movie on Netflix and the couch looks really comfortable. Very rarely does it do...
Yeah, well, that's the danger with impulsive happiness, is that it does have that present-bound quality.
And in retrospect, that can lead to a life that's not well lived.
Generally, yes. Life definitely places philosophical demands on you, whether you want it to or not. And so it is useful to step back. I mean, that's likely why the trait openness evolved. That's the creativity dimension. That's the dimension that allows people to engage in philosophical discourse and to think laterally. And it does allow you to step back and look at things on a broader scale and to generate creative alternatives. The problem with examining your assumptions is it's very disquieting, because you want things to act the way you predict and desire them to act. And you work within a set of axioms and you act them out in order to maintain that predictability, that desirable predictability. If you mess around, the more fundamental the axiom that you question, the more uncertainty you release. And some of that can be positive, but plenty of it can be anxiety provoking. I mean, just imagine that you're in a relationship and it's maybe a year into it and you haven't formalized and finalized it, but then one day you allow yourself to ask the question, is this the relationship I want to be in? Well, that's a fundamental question, but just imagine now you're destabilizing your entire future. You're destabilizing your present. You're destabilizing your past, because while engaging in the relationship, you're acting out the assumption that it's the proper relationship. But now you question that. That means the story you told yourself about what was happening while it happened, even though it's already happened, was wrong and something else had happened. And then you have to think through what actually happened. So it's unbelievably demanding. And the more axiomatic the assumption, the more certainty is cast into troublesome chaos. Now, you could say, yeah, but the alternative is worse. And I believe that often that's true. But the thing about the alternative is that you can always forestall it, right?
Mañana.
Ask that question tomorrow. You bet. And it's a very powerful temptation, and no wonder. Do you want to dig up the body now, or do you want to wait a month? It's like, well, it'll be more rotten in a month, but it's not a month. It's not now, right? It's not now. And so I understand why people don't want to delve into things, even if their emotions indicate that they should. I mean, I would see this all the time. If you're trying to settle an important issue with your partner, let's say, that can be a tremendously troublesome excavation process. And there's no shortage of pain. But if you sort it out, then maybe things can be better. Doesn't mean it's easy or pleasant. Quite the contrary. It's like surgery. It's like surgery to remove something, that shouldn't be there. It's necessary, but man, it's still surgery.
On that point of understanding my inadequacies or someone's inadequacies, I really believe that it's really difficult to undergo self-development if you don't have self-awareness. And I was really trying to understand from your writings how someone is to build their self-awareness. It's almost like the unknown unknown. If you don't have it, how do you build the thing?
Oh, I know a good exercise for that. It's like a prayer in some sense. In fact, I would say it's proper prayer. If you want to know something about yourself, sit on your bed one night and say to yourself, you got to mean this. Like, you got to be desperate. This is no game, this. It's like, my life is not everything I want it to be, and perhaps it's not everything that I need it to be. And by need, I mean my life is so unbearable that the suffering that's attendant upon that is make me nihilistic, cynical, bitter, resentful, homicidal, genocidal, unable to have a good relationship, prone to punish people for their virtues because of my jealousy, driving the proclivity to see evil everywhere except within my own heart. Like, these are problems, man. And you ask yourself, you sit on the bed and say, okay, man, I'm ready to learn something. Like, what's one thing I'm doing wrong that I know I'm doing wrong, that I could fix, that I would fix? It's like, you meditate on that, you'll get an answer. And it won't be one you want, but it'll be the necessary one. And it's often something that will point you to small things. So Carl Jung said, people in the modern world don't see God because they don't look low enough. And so imagine you're in your messy bedroom, and you're sitting on the edge of the bed trying to have an honest dialogue with yourself. And the little voice says, it's pretty disgusting in here. And you think, well, I'm way above such trivial niceties as organizing my room. It's like, well, that's pride. That's arrogance. If you're above organizing what's actually yours, how in the world are you ever going to organize anything else? And so you get on your knees and you think, well, it's time to, take a brush to the toilet. And maybe that's where you start. And that works. Like, that works. You start making those micro improvements, like real micro improvements, real on the ground, actual micro improvements to things that are wrong, you'll improve unbelievably rapidly. Thoughts on the drug epidemic? Well, I'm not sure there is an epidemic any more than there always has been. I know that there is now a tilt towards drugs in the US in particular, like meth and fentanyl and the other opiates, and that's quite a catastrophe. A lot of that is occurring among people who don't have meaning in their lives, I would say. And you might think that's a facile answer, but it's not. Like, here's the rat literature. Like, if you take a lab rat, typical lab rat is, genetically bred to be identical with many other lab rats, and he lives alone in a cage, and he's got a pretty miserable rat life because rats are social animals and they don't like to live in cages by themselves. And you can get a lab rat in a cage addicted to cocaine in no time flat, and he'll like press a lever for cocaine reward, pretty much to the exclusion of all else, including sex and often including food. But if you take that same rat and you put him in a rat family, in a rat social hierarchy, in a rat environment, and give him something that rat like to do so that he can be satisfied, it's very difficult to get him addicted to cocaine. And so I would say the reason that people take psychomotor stimulants, and all the drugs of serious abuse are psychomotor stimulants, regardless of what else they might be, they activate the dopaminergic system, which is the system that tracks reward and that is associated, that's activated when you pursue valuable goal-directed behavior. If you don't have that, if you don't have a valid goal, if you don't have no real valid meaning in your life, if you don't have a valid ambition, then you don't have any way of activating that system. And why the hell wouldn't you take drugs? It's like you have to have something better to do to not addict yourself. you know. So I would say that a huge part of the current epidemic in the US in particular is manifest among broken men who have no real place in society, and providing them with money isn't going to help that. They need a productive and meaningful existence, and which is the paramount goal, should be the paramount goal of social policy, for example. It isn't the alleviation of poverty that's really the issue, because people in the West aren't poor. There might be a bit of a distribution problem, but we're not poor. What we have is we have a problem of meaningful engagement, and that's what has to be addressed, and that's why I do the work that I'm doing.
How much do people have to kind of date around to find somebody, though? Because it does take a bit of exploration to find somebody you're compatible with. So what's a reasonable amount of exploration, and like by what age should people have figured it out? Because I mean, there's always the grass looks greener. So at some point, maybe you should just settle down. But what are your thoughts on that?
Well, life isn't very long. And so you don't get to evaluate that many relationships. You probably only have a 5 to 10 year period to do that, something like that. And then the reason you only have that amount of time is because it gets more and more difficult as you get older rather than easier, partly because people your age are increasingly in relationships. So I would say get at it. Don't overestimate the degree to which you have to find someone versus create the relationship. You know, there's many cultures, and I'm not suggesting that this is necessarily a desirable alternative, but there are many cultures that arrange marriages, and those arranged marriages frequently work. It's not obvious that they work less frequently than relationships or marriages that are predicated on romantic attraction, which has its own pitfalls. No matter who you find, they're going to be full of flaws like you are, and so a lot of it is something you create. I think you want to find someone you can trust and someone that you're attracted to, and perhaps someone who shares the same ambitions as you do, or at least has ambitions that are compatible with yours. And then pretty much all of it after that is what you create rather than what you find.
Is part of the reason that arranged relationships or arranged marriages work, is part of it because there's a societal pressure to not get divorced, and because it's somebody your parents have chosen, there might be an expectation that you're supposed to uphold?
Of course. I mean, that's partly why marriages in the West work too, or marriages in cultures where the primary impetus for the marriage is romantic or sexual attraction. Part of the reason those marriages work is because of social pressure. It's very difficult to sustain a relationship across time, and you need all sorts of social institutions as well as conceptual schemes operating to help ensure that that's the case. Because life is so difficult, you're going to go through periods of time where your relationship is extraordinarily difficult, but there's no escaping that. And if the pressure to stay together wasn't there, the relationship might fragment prematurely. And then not only would you have your problems, you'd also not have any relationships. And that's not helpful. So you go through thick and thin together. And it can be very thin. The thin times can be very thin. But the collective judgment of the human race so far has been that long-term monogamous relationships are the best that you can manage. And that's true cross-culturally. There are exceptions. Polygamy is relatively common, nowhere near as common as monogamy, but there are exceptions made for polygamy. But the problem with polygamous societies is that they tend to be more violent, especially the young men in them tend to be more violent because they are more shut out of the mating game, and that makes them very frustrated.
Oh, that makes sense. So it'd be mostly, that makes sense. That'd make me pissed off too. Why does this guy over here have 7 wives? He'd be better off dead.
Yes. And I might be the one to help him along with that.
Yeah.
I mean, that's part of what monogamy does is stabilize societies. And that means that in stable societies, fewer people die. And so all things considered, our species has decided that that's a good trade-off.
How is it that discipline and the straight and narrow offer the best chance for a good life? And how is it that we have forgotten that is the case?
Well, the reason that discipline is necessary is because you're a mass of competing short-term interests. And so the question is then, well, which short-term interest should win out? And the answer to that is, well, none of them. They need to be organized into a hierarchy that makes them functional across time and across individuals. So like a 2-year-old is very likely to act out his or her proximal impulse. But of course, a 2-year-old can't survive in the world. You have to bring your primary instincts, let's say, under the regulatory structure of a higher order value system that allows them to manifest themselves without undue mutual sacrifice across large spans of time in the presence of large numbers of other people. So that requires a very sophisticated ordering. It's like, we already talked about the fact that a meta-narrative is necessary to unite subcultures, say, so that they can operate peacefully and harmoniously within the same space. The same thing applies within you, because you're an internal coalition of warring single-minded tribes, and they have to all be brought under the organizational structure of long-term collective vision, let's say. Mm-hmm. And in order to do that, you have to be disciplined. And any discipline, technically speaking, is an attempt to bring all those competing short-term impulses under a larger scale and more inclusive framework. And so you do that, and then, well, that's actually what gives you freedom. Being impulsive and being free aren't the same things, because if you're impulsive, you're just the slave of your impulses.
Right.
There's no freedom in that. That's the same freedom, so to speak, literally, that a 2-year-old has, because a 2-year-old isn't socialized yet. So it's a completely, that doesn't function in the sophisticated world. It doesn't work.
Right.
Everyone knows it. My father gave me an abiding, and then the other thing I should say about him is he spent a tremendous amount of time with me when I was very young, say before I was 5 or 6. He taught me to read. He did that every night for months, and I remember that very vividly, and instilled in me a love of books and a fluency in reading. He believed that I could do what I set my mind to. And he really believed that. And to have someone that believe that of you, that's something, man. And, it was something that I wanted to offer to my clinical clients, because I did believe that there was more to them than the suffering person that was sitting there, and that, with joint diligent effort, we could sift our way through the chaff and find the wheat, and that things could be better. And one of the lovely things about practicing as a clinician was that almost inevitably happened, and sometimes really radically. And then, of course, later it started to happen on a broader scale, and I was seeing that happen in the lives of maybe thousands of people.
We're built to walk uphill. And when you reach the pinnacle of the hill, you want to stop and appreciate the vision, but the next thing you want is a higher hill in the distance, because it's the uphill climb that it's from the uphill climb that we derive our value. And I mean this technically. So almost all the positive emotion we feel, especially the emotion that fills us with enthusiasm, and that's to be filled with the Spirit of God, by the way, because that's what enthusiasm means. That's experienced in relationship to a goal. And so in some sense, and this is part of the religious enterprise, you want a goal that you can never attain. Right? So you can always move closer to the goal that recedes as you move towards it. You think, well, that's frustrating. It's like Sisyphus pushing the rock uphill. But it's not, because as you pursue that goal, you put yourself together and your life does get better and richer and more abundant. And that's why the highest levels of virtue and goal are in some sense transcendent. You want them to be above everything you're doing so you can continually move towards something that's more sublime and better. That's what you are. You're here to live, not to sleep. And the problem with the vision of Mai Tais on the beach is that, well, first of all, that's a vision of drug-induced unconsciousness. Second, it's only going to work for about a week. Third, you're going to be a laughingstock in a month, and depressed and aimless and goalless. You want a horizon of ever-expanding possibility. And so it does happen to people because they've staked their soul on the attainment of an instrumental goal. And it can be a pretty high order goal. It was in your case. But then you think, well, now I'm there. Now what? Well, the answer can't be, well, I'm going to live in the lap of luxury and never have to leave the face. What do you want to be? A giant infant with a gold bottle? You never have to do anything but lay in your back and suck. It's like, well, you see the problem with that as a conceptualization. It's no, you want to be like an active warrior moving uphill with your sword in hand. And that's dynamic, that's exciting. And that's why so many young men disappear into video games. That's all acted out in the video game. So they have to act that out in their own life. Not that I despise video games, because I don't, but they're not a substitute for life. They might be good training under some conditions for life.
You go to a party, your heart's beating. Why? The party is a monster. Why? Because it's judging you. And it's judging you, it's putting you low down the dominance hierarchy, because that's what a negative judgment is. And that interferes with your sexual success. And that means that you're being harshly evaluated by nature itself, right? So you are confronting the dragon of chaos when you go into the social situation. And so what do? You're like this, right? You hunch over, and that's low dominance. I'm no threat. It's like, well, that's not going to get you very far, but that's a logical thing to do in the face of a tyrant. So I'm no threat. You look at the king and you're dead. I'm no threat. I'm hunched over. And then what's happening internally? What are people thinking about me? What are people thinking about me? Am I looking stupid? Am I looking foolish? Geez, I'm awkward. I hate being here. Man, I'm sweating too much. It's all internalized, right? It's all self-focused. The eye isn't working. What do you tell people? Don't stop thinking about yourself, because you can't. It's like, don't think of a white elephant. White elephant, white elephant, white elephant. You can't tell someone to stop thinking about something because they get caught in a loop. What you do with socially anxious people is you say, look at other people. Look at them, right? Why? Because if you look at them, you can tell what they're thinking. And then unless you're terribly socialized, and some people are. Some people have no social skills. And so the reason they can't go to a party is because they don't even know how to introduce themselves. Like no one ever taught them how to behave. And so they're really good candidates for behavior therapy, because you walk them through the process of how you actually manifest the procedures that are associated with social acceptability. But most people aren't like that. They have the ability. So if they're really introverted and high in neuroticism, they can usually talk quite well to someone one-on-one. Why? Because they look at them. Well, if I look at you, it's another thing to do if you're ever speaking to a group of people. Never speak to the group of people. That doesn't exist. You talk to individuals, and then they reflect for you the entire group, because they're all entrained. So you look at one person, they broadcast to you what everyone's thinking, and you know how to talk to one person. So it's easy. And so as soon as you focus on the person, not you, you push your attention outward, use your eye, you push your attention outward, and you start watching, well, then all your automatic mechanisms kick in, and you stop being awkward. Because if we're talking, and I'm looking here, I don't know what you're going to do next, and I'm going to put disjunctions into they're like bad chords in the melody of our conversation. And the reason is I'm not paying attention. So that's why the eye is the thing at the top of the pyramid. It's like the thing that enables you to win the set of all possible dominance hierarchies is the eye. Pay attention. Pay attention. That's the critical issue. That's why the Egyptians worshipped Horus. That's why Horus was the thing that rescued Osiris from the depths. It's the capacity to pay attention. What do you pay attention to most? What your right hemisphere signals as anomalous. It attracts your attention. It's like, this isn't going quite right. I'm not looking at that. Wrong. That's what you look at. That's what you look at. What's not going right. Because that's the terrible monster that might eat you, but it's also the place you get all the information. So that's why it's useful to have discussions with your enemies, because they will tell you things you do not know. And that's such a great thing, because if you don't know them, well, you're not very smart, are you? There may be a time when you go somewhere that's the thing you need to know. And maybe your enemy will tell you why you're such a fool, and a bunch of other things that aren't true too. But even one thing that's accurate, it's like, yeah, thanks very much, man. Maybe I'll do some work on that, and I won't have to carry that forward. So, and then that's part of the reason, again, why the terrible predator, it's always the terrible predator that has the gold. It's like, it's the person who delivers the message you do not want to hear. So it's rough, but it doesn't matter. Life is rough. Responsibility. That's what gives life meaning. It's like lift a load. Then you can tolerate yourself, right? Because look at, you're useless, easily hurt, easily killed. Why should you have any self-respect? That's the story of the fall. Pick something up and carry it. Make it heavy enough so that you can think, yeah, well, useless as I am, at least I could move that from there to there. Well, what's really cool about that is that when I talk to these crowds about this, the men's eyes light up. And that's very, like I've seen that phenomenon because I've been talking about this mythological material for a long time. And I can see when I'm watching crowds, people, you know, their eyebrows lift, their eyes light up because I put something together for them. And that's what mythological stories do. So I'm not taking responsibility for that. That's what the stories do. So I say the story and people go click, 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 you know, and their eyes light up. But this responsibility thing, that's a whole new order of this, is that young men are so hungry for that, it is unbelievable. And one of the things I've been talking to some of the people who've been running for the Conservative leadership in Canada, and I've been talking to them about, well, the difficulties they have communicating with young people, because Conservatives, what the hell are they going to sell to young people, right? Because being Conservative is something that happens when you're older. They can sell responsibility.
Aim yourself in one direction. And I had a rule with my clients because, you know, you might say, well, I've gone halfway down this path and I found out it's wrong. So how do you distinguish that from just giving up? Well, that's a really hard question, right? It's a moral hazard because it's inappropriate to continue in a direction you now realize to be wrong, but it's also inappropriate to give up and use that rationalization as an excuse. And how do you distinguish?
Especially seeing as we're not transparent to ourselves.
Well, right, exactly. So that is genuinely a moral hazard. So one of the principles that I tried to abide by in my therapeutic discussions was you can change course as long as the next thing you do is equally or more difficult. Because that's a check against just giving up. So you want to discipline yourself so you can get yourself organized so that you can go in a particular direction, so that when you find the right direction, you can really go in that direction. And that does require an apprenticeship of sorts. And it might not matter in some sense exactly what the apprenticeship is, as long as it is rigorous, right? And so that's sort of a bridge between moral relativism and moral absolutism. There's lots of games you can play. It's not that obvious a priori which is the best game, so that's kind of a morally relative stance. There's multiple playable games. But then the absolute is, yeah, but you have to play one of them. You have to learn to play one of them. You have to become an expert at least one of them. And then that's not a relative proposition. And I believe that's true. That seems to me to be the case. So you want to commit to something. And then when you commit to something, you require yourself to bring all of your disparate components moving in a single direction, united in a single direction. So it's a unifying act. And then once having been unified, well, then you can bring that unity to bear on a variety of different tasks. But you have to bring it together first. So, and that makes sense developmentally. You see children start out as a disparate bundle of motivations and emotions sort of warring with one another. And then they can integrate that into single games that they can play with themselves. And then they integrate that with games they start to play with other people. And all of that is integration. It's not subjugation. It's not repression. Not if it's a good game. It's integration. You want to get integrated because then you have all the horses that are pulling your chariot pulling in the same direction. And you're much more likely to get to where you want to go then, and also much more likely to specify a good place to go. So that's that's something else conservatives have to teach young people, which is, well, get yourself disciplined. Well, why? Well, not so you're a slave, but so that you could be a master. To use a terminology that you're not supposed to use anymore. But this is in relationship to yourself, not to others. So, yeah. And to begin with, you have to accept an external master because you just don't have the wisdom to do that for yourself, or the ability or the opportunity often. Everybody knows this. They feel bad when they decide they're going to get themselves in good shape and go to the gym, and lasts like 3 days. Attempts. Yeah. And then no one's happy about the fact that they quit.
and they berate themselves for it. And we know that we need to go through a disciplinary process, and we need to subjugate ourselves to a disciplinary process. That's part of the problem with the constant harping about the, oppressive patriarchy. It's like, well, you need a disciplinary process. So, well, that's just oppression and slavery. It's like, no, it's not. No more than a game is. Not a good game. A good game isn't oppression and slavery.
You're going to have to put some effort into your life. And you need to be motivated to do that. And so what are the potential sources of motivation? Well, you could think about them in the big five manner. If you're extroverted, you want friends. If you're agreeable, you want an intimate relationship. If you're disagreeable, you want to win competitions. If you're open, you want to engage in creative activity. If you're high in neuroticism, you want security. Okay, so those are all sources of potential motivation that you could draw on, that you could tailor to your own, your own personality. But then there are dimensions that you want to consider your life across. And so we ask people about, well, if you could have your life the way you wanted it in 3 to 5 years, if you were taking care of yourself properly, what would you want from your friendships? What would you want from your intimate relationship? How would you like to structure your family? What do you want for your career? Well, how are you going to use your time outside of your job? And how are you going to regulate your mental and physical health, and maybe also your drug and alcohol use? Because that's a good place to auger down, because alcoholism, for example, wipes out, 5 to 10% of people. So you want to keep that under control. And then so maybe you develop a vision of what you would like your life to be, and that associates the goal. Well, once the goal is established, and then you break down the goal into micro processes that you can implement, the micro processes become rewarding in proportion, in relation to their causal association with the goal, and that tangles in your incentive reward system. We talked about the dopaminergic incentive reward system, and that's the thing that keeps you moving forward. And the way it works is that it works better if it produces positive emotion when it can see you moving towards a valued goal. Okay, well, what's the implication of that? Better have a valued goal, because otherwise you can't get any positive motivation working out. And so the more valuable the goal, in principle, the more the micro processes associated with that goal start to take on a positive charge. And so what that means is, well, you get up in the morning and you're excited about the day, you're ready to go. And so as far as I can tell, what you do is you specify your long-term ideal. Maybe you also specify a place you want to stay the hell away from, so that you're terrified to fail as well as excited about succeeding, because that's also useful. You specify your goal. You do that in some sense as a unique individual. You want to specify goals that make you say, oh, if that could happen as a consequence of my efforts, it would clearly be worthwhile. Because the question always is, why do something? Because doing nothing is easy. You just sit there and you don't do anything. That's real easy. The question is, why would you ever do anything? And the answer to that has to be because you've determined by some means that it's worthwhile. And then the next question might be, well, where should you look for worthwhile things? And one would be, well, you could consult your own temperament. And the other would be, well, you kind of look at what it is that people accrue that's valuable across the lifespan. So you do a structural analysis of the subcomponents of human existence, and I already did that. You need a family, you need friends. Like, you don't need to have all these things, but you better have most of them. Family, friends, career, educational goals, plans for, time outside of work, attention to your mental and physical health, etc. That's what life is about. And if you don't have any of those things, well, then all you've got left is misery and suffering. So that's a bad deal for you.
When I was 25 or so, I probably weighed about 138 pounds. I smoked like a pack of cigarettes a day. I drank tremendous amount of alcohol. I was from northern Alberta, this rough little town up in northern Alberta called Fairview. And, there were long winters there, and my friends were heavy drinkers, and most of them dropped out of school by the time they were 15 or 16, went off to work on the oil rigs. And, it was a rough town, and we drank a lot. I started when I was 14, and, and so I had a lot of bad habits, let's say, and and I wasn't in great shape physically, and I was also still intellectually obsessed as I am now, and so that would have been in 85. But I decided around then, about 85, 84, something like that, maybe a little earlier, that I was really going to try to get my act together, and so I started doing that. First of all, I quit smoking. Well, that took a long time because I eventually had to quit drinking too in order to quit smoking. And I started working out, started playing sports, which I'd never done. I had a fine time when I was a kid, but I needed really to get disciplined. And I had to do it because I was working on these hard problems that I've been discussing with all of you, and I've been working on them really, obsessively since I was probably about 18, maybe even earlier than that. And got to the point around 25 when I was in graduate school trying to get my PhD, so doing all my research. Like I published 15 papers by the time I graduated with my PhD, which was by a fairly large measure the most papers that any graduate student at that time had ever published at McGill. I think that's right. It might have been twice as many, or maybe twice as many, maybe even 3 times as many. And at the same time, I wrote Maps of Meaning, which was a terribly difficult thing to do because I was writing about 3 hours a day doing that. And I couldn't do all that and continue with my misbehavior, my sort of, what would you say, my hedonistic, my massive hedonistic consumption of alcohol and all of that. I just couldn't keep it up and also work seriously on the issues that were at hand. So, I had to stop. That's a sacrifice. I had to stop messing about and straighten myself out. Becoming more articulate is definitely, I would say, that's the primary array of weapons. So, physical prowess is something, and it's not nothing, that physical confidence that comes along with that as well. But the same thing replicated at the level of the ability to communicate and to think, that's a way broader field of battle and opportunity. So this is one thing that isn't taught well, especially to boys. It's more important to teach it to boys, I would say, because they're more skeptical of the educational enterprise in general, generally speaking, partly because they're less obedient, partly because they're less agreeable. That's particularly true for disagreeable boys. And agreeable boys get higher grades independent of their IQ and their academic achievement, because they're easier to deal with. So what do you tell disagreeable boys? There's nothing that makes you more formidable than verbal competence, than being able to articulate, be able to think, to marshal your arguments, right? It's a battlefield metaphor, to get everything in order, to get all your information straight, to marshal your forces. And so, that's part of the reason that rap artists are so popular, especially among disaffected young men, black and white alike, because they're unbelievably articulate. Like they have this incredible verbal prowess. It's unbelievably attractive, and it's associated with genuine artistic and redemptive activity, often focusing on something that's approximately the voice of the underclass, let's say, but a powerful voice, right? And it's interesting to see how many young white guys identify with that. Because people think that the purpose of memory is to remember the past. And that's not the purpose of memory. The purpose of memory is to extract out from the past lessons to structure the future. And that's the purpose of personal memory. And so you're done with a memory when you've extracted out the information that you can use to guide yourself properly in the future. So if you have a traumatic memory, for example, that's really obsessing you, if you analyze that memory to the point where you figured out how you put yourself at risk and you can determine how you might avoid that in the future, then the emotion associated with that goes away. So memory has a very pragmatic function. And cultural memory is the same thing, is that we need to extract out stories from our past that structure our future. And we need that because, well, first of all, if you don't have a purpose, let's say, it isn't that your life becomes neutral in a meaningless sense. It's that your life becomes characterized by unbearable suffering, because the baseline condition of life is something like unbearable suffering. And what you have to set against that is a noble and worthwhile purpose. And hopefully your determination of that purpose is buttressed to some degree by the wisdom of the past, because you can't conjure something like that up on your own. And if you provide people with nobility of purpose, then they can tolerate the suffering of existence without becoming entirely corrupted by it. And cultures that don't do that, it isn't even so much that they die, it's that cultures that don't do that are dead, They're done. They don't have a story anymore. And they don't have a call to adventure. And then everyone suffers stupidly as a consequence. It's a very bad thing. So Churchill made the same observation that many of the great psychologists and philosophers made in the early part of the 20th century. It's like, bring the story forward and propagate it and make it the most noble possible story. And then you motivate people to transcend themselves, which they need to do. So yes, he's exactly right in his diagnosis. There's an entire literature, psychoanalytic literature, on the dangers of overcompassion, hyperprotectiveness, helicopter parenting, all of that. When you have children, you have to encourage them. You have to encourage them to take risks because they have to grow up and take their place in the world. You can't protect them too much because if you do, you destroy them. That's the motif of Hansel and Gretel, right? 2 kids lost in the woods. They find the gingerbread house. That's a little bit too good to be true, right? It's not only shelter when you need it, but it's candy. What lives inside the house that's too good to be true? The witch that devours you, right? That's excess compassion. So you don't want your mother to do everything for you, that's for sure. There's a rule if you're dealing with the elderly in like extended care homes. Don't do anything for your clients that they can do themselves because you undermine their autonomy. And so there's a certain amount of harshness that goes along with that, just as there is if you're a good mother, because you have to separate yourself from your child and allow them to make hurtful mistakes, right? I mean, it's very difficult if you're a compassionate person to stand back far enough to let your children take necessary risks.
But one thing I'm not getting, there's a big difference between letting people do something for themselves and saying men should be dangerous. By dangerous, that implies I should be ready to threaten someone, to hurt somebody.
No, you should be capable of it. But that doesn't mean you should use it. There's nothing to you otherwise. Like if you're not a formidable force, there's no morality in your self-control. If you're incapable of violence, not being violent isn't a virtue. People who teach martial arts know this full well, right? If you learn a martial art, you learn to be dangerous, but simultaneously you learn to control it. Both of those come together. And the combination of that capacity for danger and the capacity for control is what brings about the virtue. Otherwise, you confuse weakness with moral virtue. I'm harmless, therefore I'm good. It's like, no, that isn't how it works. That isn't how it works at all. If you're harmless, you're just weak. And if you're weak, you're not going to be good. You can't be, because it takes strength to be good. It's very difficult to be good. Well, it's a hierarchy of virtue, I would say. You know, there's an old idea that God is the sum of all that's good. I don't think sum is exactly the right metaphor. It's more like, imagine there are eternal verities: truth, beauty, justice, love, courage, fortitude, compassion. Think of all those things as virtues. So virtue is what all virtues have in common. Virtue is what all virtues have in common. That's the relationship of God to the good. God is the essence of the good. So, well, we put that aside for a moment. Or you may think, how would that manifest itself in your life? Well, that might be pursuit of the good. And that's the pursuit of the good that unites all proximal goods. And well, what is that exactly? Well, it's something like the belief that it would be for the best that all things flourish to the degree that that's possible. When I was a clinician, I thought of that as the good in me serving the best in my clients. And I think the desire for that to happen, that's love. So that's the desire for, you say, well, you take a human, bent, broken, miserable, malevolent, hurt, corrupt, weak, pathetic, contemptible, frustrating, disappointing, all of those things that we can lay on ourselves because of our inadequacies. It's like, it's easy to dismiss that. And part of that dismissal is what drives the notion that the planet has too many people on it and that we're a cancer on the face of the earth. It's like, it's not easy to love that. Well, what do you want? You want the broken people to rise up out of their brokenness rather than despise them for it. And then you orient yourself towards that and try to pull that out of people and yourself. And you have to have that frame first. That's what you're aiming for. And maybe that would be the opposite of hell. This is one thing I would say that unites Sam Harris and I, despite our differences in in belief in some sense at the level of detail. Sam is very acutely aware of the reality of malevolence and hell. Now, he wouldn't frame that metaphysically or religiously, but it doesn't really matter. He is doing his best to aim away from that as hard as he possibly can. See, I didn't realize till the last time I talked to him that Sam identified the religious tradition, the dogmatic religious tradition, with the totalitarianism that produces atrocity. Now, I think that's a misidentification, the same way the Marxists blame inequality on capitalism. Inequality is really a problem, but it's not the fault of capitalism, and totalitarian atrocity is really a problem. But to identify that reflexively with religion, or even with religious dogma, that's a mistake. Dogma, maybe, but even that's tricky, because what's the difference between dogma and knowledge? You know, today's knowledge is tomorrow's dogma. And drawing the line between those two is extremely difficult. You can't just abandon everything you think, even though it's arbitrary. You need it to guide you. And it can transform into totalitarian dogma and promote atrocity in the service of its no longer valid maintenance. But that's a very complicated problem.
Pick up your damn suffering and bear it. And try to be a good person so you don't make it worse. Well, that's a truth. You know, I read a lot about the terrible things that people have done to each other. You just cannot even imagine it. It's so awful. So you don't want to be someone like that. Now, do you have a reason to be? Yes. You have lots of reasons to be. God, there's reasons to be resentful about your existence. Everyone you know is going to die. You know, you too. And there's going to be a fair bit of pain along the way, and lots of it's going to be unfair. It's like, yeah, no wonder you're resentful. It's like, act it out and see what happens. You make everything you're complaining about infinitely worse. There's this idea that hell is a bottomless pit, and that's because no matter how bad it is, some stupid son of a bitch like you could figure out a way to make it a lot worse. So you think, well, what do you do about that? Well, you accept it. That's what life is like. It's suffering. That's what the religious people have always said. Life is suffering. Yes. Well, who wants to admit that? Well, just think about it. Well, so what do you do in the face of that suffering? Try to reduce it. Start with yourself. What good are you? Get yourself together, for Christ's sake, so that when your father dies, you're not whining away in a corner, and you can help plan the funeral, and you can stand up solidly so that people can rely on you. That's better. Don't be a damn victim. Of course you're a victim. Jesus, obviously. Put yourself together. And then maybe if you put yourself together, you know how to do that. You know what's wrong with you, if you'll admit it. You know there's a few things you could like polish up a little bit, that you might even be able to manage in your insufficient present condition. And so you might shine yourself up a little bit, and then your eyes will be a little more open, and then you can shine yourself up a little bit more, and then maybe you could bring your family together instead of having them be the hateful, spiteful, neurotic, infighting batch that you're like doomed to spend Christmas with. So then you fix yourself up a little bit, kind of humbly, because, you know, God, you're a fixer-upper if there ever was one. And then you got to figure out, well, can you figure out how to make peace with your idiot brother? And probably not, because he's just as dumb as you, so how the hell are you going to manage that? And so then maybe you get somewhere that way, and your family's sort of functioning, and you find out, well, that kind of relieved a little bit of suffering, although it reduced the opportunities for spiteful revenge, and that's kind of a pain in the neck. And so then you get your family together a little bit, and you're a little clued in then, at least a bit, because you've done something difficult that's actually difficult. You're a little wiser, and so then maybe you could put a tentative finger out beyond the family and try to change some little thing without wrecking it. It's like, our society is complex, and we teach our students that they could just fix it. It's like, go fix a military helicopter and see how far you get with that. It's like, what are you going to do? You're like a chimp with a wrench. Whack! Oh, look, it's better. It's like, no, it's not better. Things are complicated, and to fix things is really hard. And you have to be like a golden tool to fix things, and you're not. So, and that's the other message of the West. It's like, how do you overcome the suffering of life? And I'm not saying it's only the message of the West. How do you overcome the suffering of life? Is be a better person. That's how you do it. Well, that's hard. It takes responsibility. And I think, you know, if you said to someone, you want to have a meaningful life? Everything you do matters. That's the definition of a meaningful life. But everything you do matters. So you're going to have to carry that with you. Or do you want to just forget about the whole meaning thing, and then you don't have any responsibility because who the hell cares, and you can wander through life doing whatever you want, gratifying impulsive desires for how useful that's going to be, and you're stuck in meaninglessness, but you don't have any responsibility. Which one do you want? Well, ask yourself, which one are you pursuing? And you'll find very rapidly that it isn't the majority of your soul that's pursuing the whole meaning thing, because, well, look what you have to do that. You have to take on the fact that life is suffering. You have to put yourself together in the face of that. Well, that's hard.
I stopped wasting time. That helped a lot. I stopped drinking. I stopped going to bars. I really didn't spend a lot of time with my friends when I had young kids in particular. I had friends and I saw them, you know, with some degree of regularity, but where I cut corners was more with social life outside my family. So I spent a lot of time with my wife, and I spent a lot of time with my kids, and I spent a lot of time on my career. And so you have to make choices. And I think those were reasonable choices. I'm not displeased with them. Don't abandon your friendships, but you can certainly look at where you're wasting time and just stop doing things that you know to be a waste of time. So, and I did. And so I had enough room for my marriage, and I had enough room for my kids, and I had enough room for my career. And you know, sort of a multi-dimensional career. And it was always a challenge to me too, to see how efficient I could get. And you could also, and I've really recommended this for relatively higher income, dual income couples who are trying to pursue dual careers, kids, and a marriage. You can outsource, you know, hire a cleaning lady if you can afford it. Buy restaurant food if you can afford it, etc. You know, you can outsource. You can have someone do your laundry, and then you can concentrate on your marriage and your kids. I know that you know is only an avenue available to people who have relatively high incomes, but people who have dual incomes have relatively high incomes, and so outsource what's unnecessary so that you can concentrate on what's necessary. I mean, I didn't do that when I was beginning my career, because when I lived in the United States, when I was in my late 20s and starting my family, we had one income. You'd think a Harvard beginning professor makes a lot of money, and I suppose that's true in some absolute sense, but relatively speaking, you know, we didn't have enough money to buy magazines. We all our money went for housing cost and the basic necessities of living. I had a car that was 20 years old. 25 years old, I think. It was old. It was a bloody thing. The doors fell apart on the person I sold it to, you know, like 6 months down the road. They knew it was a wreck at that point, but we drove that thing right into the ground. So I know that's not necessarily possible for everyone at the beginning of their career, but if you have two incomes, you can manage it. I concentrated on my marriage and making time for it. I concentrated on spending time with my kids consciously, and I concentrated on developing my career. Those were the three elements of my life. And I had some time left over for creative pursuits and for friends, but most of it was a matter of getting rid of time wastes of any sort, you know, and I just pushed that out of my life, you know, day after day until I wasn't wasting any time or virtually no time. And, you know, I've asked my undergraduates frequently how much time they waste per day, and the general estimates are like 6 to 8 hours of time they regard themselves as wasting. Like that's a whole career right there, right? So if you just stop wasting time, you can do a tremendous amount, especially if you also try to maximize efficiency. And I always found that incredibly motivating. You know, a motivating game. How much can I do in the least amount of time possible? That's fun to try to do that as far as I'm concerned. I know, you know, that's maybe undoubtedly a temperamental thing, but if you're wired that way, that's a great meta strategy. Become efficient. I always asked my graduate students when they were designing experiments, they'd come with a proposal. I'd say to them, you know, is there any way you could do this 10 times faster? What would you have to cut? What would you have to change to do this 10 times faster? And you can learn to do that. I also learned to force the task to fit the time. There's this dictum, work expands to fill the time allowed for its completion. Work expands to fill the time allowed for its completion. Well, there's a corollary to that, which is work becomes more efficient in proportion to the restrictions of time placed upon it. So if you say, well, this could take me 2 weeks, but I'm going to do the best job I could in 1 day, you'd be amazed. You can get 90% of the way or 95% of the way, or sometimes even farther in that day. So that's another way of becoming efficient. If you only have 10 minutes to do something that should maybe take you 2 hours, maybe you can figure out how to do it in 10 minutes. You can get dreadfully efficient. So that's very much worthwhile in my estimation. If you want to do a lot of things, what else are you going to do? Rather than become efficient, if you want to do many things, you don't have much choice. But I found it extremely entertaining to try to do that. And when I was healthy, I could do a tremendous amount in a very short period of time. I'm very frustrated that that's not so much the case now, although perhaps it's coming back to some degree.
If I've got a friend in my life or a partner that I want to encourage to come out of their place of despair into a better place, how do I effectively do that without overpowering them or stifling them or making them feel inadequate, which is sometimes the consequence of trying to change someone you love?
Well, example's good. But then I would say disabuse yourself of the notion that you know what is best for this person. Not only do you not know, you actually don't want that responsibility for 2 reasons. Let's say they do what you say and something good happens to them. Well, whose victory is that? Yours or theirs? And if it's yours, did you just steal it? And then let's say they fail following your advice. Well, they pay the price for that. And you can skip away merrily and say, well, I should have spoke more carefully. It's like, you don't mess about with people's destiny. You do not know where they're headed. Now, having said that, you do what you're doing in this interview, in this podcast. You ask people questions, real questions, like, how are you feeling? Oh, I'm not doing so good today. Well, what's up? What's going on? And you can't think, well, I'm going to ask questions to lead this person in a particular direction, because that's the same game, the same instrumental game. You have to see what it is that you want to know. I see this when people ask me questions after my lectures, Now and then, or during a Q&A, now and then people get up and they'll ask a real question. It's part of the ongoing dialogue. Something struck them. They stand up. There's something they really want to know. It's an honest question. And that goes real well. But not infrequently, someone stands up with a little prepared speech that's packaged as a question. So I get this from Christian traditionalists fairly frequently. They get up and they ask me about my religious convictions, but really what they want to do is corner me into admitting that I should accept Jesus Christ as my Savior and join a particular, let's say, denomination. It's not a question. It's just a manipulation. And so your questions, like your statements, your questions should be honest. And if you ask people questions and you really listen, they will untangle themselves. And that's partly why people love to be attended to, Like, if I meet people on the street, I ask them their name. They're all usually flustered when they come up to me. They don't really want to interrupt me, and then they're flustered. And the first thing I do is shake their hand and ask them their name. And I listen, I'm not that good at remembering names, but I listen to it. And they know how to say their name. And so it kind of settles them down. And then it sort of marks them out as a person against the background, And then if I pay attention to them and listen, they will tell me something in like 10 seconds that I need to know. Because they have something to say, And then if you listen, people tell you what they have to say, and then you get wise because you collect all that. And so you want to help someone. Well, first of all, you would decide that you're aiming towards help, right? And that you do that in the spirit of ignorance. This is what every good clinician learns is, I don't know where you're headed. I don't know what's wrong with you. This is a hard problem, man. It's like, what's your problem? I don't know what your problem is. So let's find that out first, and then let's find out one thing you can ask people. This is actually useful in an argument with someone you love. They're upset with you. What are your preconditions for satisfaction? Now, I wouldn't state it like that. It's like, if I could give you what you wanted right now in the context of this argument, and I wasn't doing it in a manipulative way, what is it that I would have to say or do that would in principle satisfy you? And that's a hard question, you know? And the person might say, well, I think you should apologize and about this, and, you know, and then I will say, what words should I use? And they'll say, well, if you loved me, you'd know. And I would say, no, I'm stupid and ignorant, and I don't know what the right words are to satisfy you. So why don't you give me a hand with that, and I'll utter them inelegantly and awkwardly in a good faith demonstration of my commitment to peace. And that won't be so good, because maybe it would have been better if I came up with it myself, but maybe next time I can do slightly better. And that works. It requires the person who's after you to think through the question even of whether there's anything that could be said or done that would satisfy them. And if the answer to that is no, well, probably the relationship is over. But certainly the person that they're accusing has been put in an absolutely impossible position. But usually, almost inevitably, if the person meditates on it for a bit, there is something that would satisfy them that can be negotiated, as long as they're willing to give you the opportunity to do it, you know, stupidly and badly. So, listening, man. Jimmy Carr, I talked to Jimmy Carr 2 weeks ago, the famous comedian. Yeah, it was real interesting. He said comedy is the most dialogical of the entertainment forms. And I thought, well, what do you mean by that? Because you're just, it's a monologue, right? Now, I do monologues, but I pay attention to the audience, right? I'm always talking to individual people in the audience and watching their reactions and listening to the audience as a whole. So even though it's a lecture, let's say, or a talk, I'm watching the audience and responding. So we're in a kind of dance. Well, Carr pointed out that comedians, before they hit the road, and this is virtually invariably the case, they have their new routines. So their corpus of potentially funny jokes. And then they do 200 shows in front of small audiences. And the audience either laughs or doesn't. And if you're listening, you collect all the jokes that people laugh at. If you do that 200 times, you have nothing but hilarious material. But you listened. And then you can go out on the road. And that was very interesting to me, because humor is a mysterious phenomenon, experientially and conceptually. And it's sort of precognitive and instinctual, but it's also extremely sophisticated. And there's an element of transcendence about it, right? Because you can laugh at yourself. And that's in some sense the highest form of humor. And so it's so interesting that we can criticize and elevate ourselves at the same time, and that we find that intensely pleasurable. And so a good comedian collects ways to do that, shares them with the audience, and he's listening. And so if you want to help someone, the best way to help someone is not to give them advice, but to listen to them. Life has proximal meanings, right? There's the meaning that you experience when you're engaged in a piece of art, or when you're reading, or when you're engrossed in a movie or in a conversation. There's the meaning that emerges within your relationships with people that you cherish or are enthusiastic with. There's meanings of security and predictability. There's meanings of duty and responsibility and active engagement with your job and your career. There's meanings of aesthetic pleasure. Now, all of those have their value, and each of them has their place. And, you know, maybe there's a hierarchy of value there as well, so that some of those meanings are deeper than others. And then you might say, well, what characterized the deepest of all meanings? And it would be something like relationship with the transcendent, and that would establish a relationship between you and what's always been conceptualized as God, which is generally supposed to be something ineffable, right? It's not definable, but you might think about it as the central animating spirit of the age, or
the value around which all other values are organized, or the wisdom of the ages, or the creative spirit that possesses you when you're inspired, or what grips you with enthusiasm at a sports event or at a musical event, all of those things. And we need a relationship with that. And we find our deepest meaning in that relationship. And if we don't find it, I think, if we don't find it in something that's explicitly religious, then we tend to magnify something of lesser value, say something political, into that to fill the void. So yes, life has proximal meanings without God, without eternity, but at the ultimate level, something's lacking. And it's the desire to fulfill that lack that, and maybe the lack itself, that's part and parcel of the religious instinct. So you can kill God, but you can't. That doesn't rectify the hunger for God. And then that hunger seeks out replacements. That's how it looks to me. So, and then, you might also say, well, does that mean you have to believe in God? And I don't think of the proper answer to that is that you need to agree with a propositional statement. Does God exist? Yes. No, like, is this table there? Yes. It's not that kind of relationship. I mean, it's characterized in the Old Testament as a struggle. So Israel means those who struggle with God. And you have to participate in that struggle. And you can do that, weirdly enough, as a believer or as a non-believer. Maybe sometimes more intensely as a non-believer. The issue might be more paramount then, the issue of virtue and the issue of the ultimate orientation.
There's so many rules that are great, but what do you think is probably, if somebody was to read those books and there's one rule that you're like, this rule out of the 24 I've given you over these past few years, you can absolutely not get this one wrong. Which rule would that be?
Tell the truth, or at least don't lie. Because you can't tell the truth, right? Because who are you to tell the truth? That's a mighty tall order, man. But you can stop saying things that you know are lies. And that will change your life if you do that. And it's crucial.
Why would it change their life?
Well, how can you adapt to reality when you falsify it? And you think, well, I'm just lying to other people. No, you're not. You can't just lie to other people, because what you say becomes you, especially if you practice it, because we build ourselves out of words. And that can be lies in action too. It's like, don't say things you know to be false. That's a good start, man. And it aligns yourself with the truth. And how can that be a bad idea? Imagine that what is true reflects reality, which is sort of the definition of true. How can failing to align yourself with reality work? How is that possibly going to work? Well, you say, well, I can, if I lie, I get away with something. It's like, no, you don't. I tell you, I swear this is true. In all of my clinical practice, I have never, ever seen anyone ever get away with anything even once. You think the chickens won't come home to roost. It's like, all that means is you're too stupid to see what your lies caused, or too blind or too self-deceptive. You just don't see it. And so you don't get away with anything, nothing. It's terrifying to actually understand that. It's terrifying. What if you can't get away with anything, ever? Well, that's the judgmental God, fundamentally. That's a very old idea, and it's an old idea for a reason. And of course you can't get away with anything, because imagine that you took a flexible plastic comb, and you bent it backwards, and you say, well, I got away with that. It's like, well, what's going to happen when you let go? It's going to snap back and hit you in the face, and that's life, man. You warp the structure of reality? You think you are someone who can warp the structure of reality with your words and get away with it? Really? No, man, that should terrify you right to the core of your soul. You're not God.
your perceptual structures are determined by the goals that you have at hand. I mean, some of that's not completely true, because your perceptual systems also have limitations, right? There's things you can't see or hear even if you need to. So there are limitations built in, but within that set of limitations, you're still trying to tune your perceptions to your motivated goals. And that's also very useful to think about when you're trying to understand artificial intelligence, because for human beings, without goals, there's no perception, because there's no filtering mechanism that you can use to determine the level of resolution at which you perceive. Anyway, so there's a thing made of smaller things which are made out of smaller things, and it's kind of my iconic representation of the complexity of the world. And then you could think, well, what is this? How can you see this object? And I think if you just look at it, you can detect, it's like a Necker cube, you know, those cubes that are line drawings that you can see the front of and then it'll flip to the back. Have you seen those? So this is kind of Necker cube-like, or at least it is for me, in that when I look at it, my perceptions play around with it. Sometimes I focus on the kind of cross-like shape in the middle, and sometimes I can see these other lines, and then sometimes I'll focus on that square, and sometimes I can see the little dots there, or maybe one dot, and my perceptions are going like this, trying to fit a pattern to it. And you can kind of detect that when you're watching it. And so I would say, well, you have the options of perceiving this in its full complexity, or you can simplify it. Essentially, there's lots of ways you can simplify it, but some of them are laid out there. So you take the complex thing, you make a low resolution representation of it. So that's the rough area that all those dots occupy. That's the rough area broken down to its 4 most fundamental quadrants. That might be how you would look at it if this was a map of an orchard and you were trying to walk from south to north. That would be a useful representation. This combines this and this. That's that's the highest level of resolution that you can perceive this object at. That's lower resolution than the object itself. So the first issue is, how should you look at things? Well, that's a problem that intelligence has to solve. So that's one of the problems that intelligence goes after. And then I think what happens is we have the thing in itself, and then we simplify it with a perception, and that's like an iconic representation, and then we nail the iconic representation with a word. And that's how we compress the world's complexity into something that we can manage. We take the complex thing, make it into an icon, and represent the icon with a word. And then when I throw you the word, so to speak, you decompose it into the icon and then decompose it even further into the thing, if you know the icon and you know the thing. And so then we can use shorthand, right? Because you have representational structures and so do I, and I'm just tossing you markers about your representational structures and you can unfold them. That's what you do when you're reading a novel, because the novel comes alive in your imagination in your own idiosyncratic way. And it wouldn't if you didn't understand the references of the novel, right? The novelist has to assume that your basic perceptual structures and your intuitions and your instincts are basically the same as his or hers, because otherwise they have to assume that, because otherwise they would be lost in an infinite regressive explanation. So, and it's problematic often. For example, if you start reading Victorian novels, you may find that it takes a while to get into them because the presuppositions, the expectations are slightly different, and so is the language. You have to update the representations.
You have to make a decision in your life, and this is a decision, and I would say that it's a voluntary element of faith, because it isn't exactly evidence-based. It's more like something you decide before you even look at the evidence. It's more like you decide to stake your life on this. Like, you know, if you decide to get married to someone, you don't really do it on the basis of the evidence that you're going to have a happy life, because you don't have that evidence. You do it, you decide that you're going to make a happy life with this person and that it's worth the risk. So you get married as an expression of faith. Okay, and so faith doesn't mean believing things that no one with any sense would believe. Faith sometimes means putting a stake in the sand and saying, here's where I stand in some sense, regardless. And you do that when you get married. You do that maybe when you pledge allegiance to a friend. You have a best friend and you want to maintain that friendship as long as you possibly can. It's a decision of faith. Maybe you do that when you decide a career, when you go to university, because you could have done something else, right? But you chose that. So that's where you put your faith. And like I said, that doesn't mean believing what no reasonable person would believe. Okay, so back to God is love. Well, I'm going to talk about being first instead of God. And being is the totality of experience. That we're going to define it that way for the purposes of this discussion. Being is what there is instead of nothing. And you experience that as a conscious creature. Being is what you experience as a conscious creature. It includes all your emotions, all your motivations, all your subjective experience, as well as everything that's objective. Okay, so it seems to me that all things considered, it's a useful move of faith to act as if you love being. And if you love something, then you want the best in it to flourish. And so maybe you decide deep in your soul that it would be better for you to act towards an end that makes everything that's good better. That's the best way to live, to make everything that's good better. And maybe to restrict the development of everything that's malevolent and evil within yourself and in the broader world, insofar as you're able to do that. And so I think that's an expression of love, is that because when you love something, you care for it. And the proper attitude towards being, I think, is care. And so that's one element of God is love. God being analogous in some way to being. Now, we could look at God more classically as the creator of being. If you assume being is good, well, it's not much of a leap to assume the creator of being is good. And maybe you adopt an attitude towards the creator of being, and that's also love. And you open your heart to existence. And maybe that's the most effective means of having existence open its heart to you. So, for example, if you love other people, you want the best for them, you want the best in you to serve the best in them. If you love them and you trust them courageously, so you open yourself up to them, I don't think it's unreasonable to assume that that's how you elicit the best from them, the best that can be elicited. You're going to get hurt sometimes and betrayed, but that's going to happen no matter what approach you take. I think that's the most effective approach. And that is perhaps the most effective approach to existence per se, to approach it with love and courage. And so that's how that looks to me. Is it a feeling like loving a person? Yes, I think it is. I think it is a feeling like loving a person. It's the generalization of that care that you would have for a child, your brother, your sister, a family member. It's the generalization of that to the broader domain of existence, to broader domains of existence. And I think that's a skill in some sense, right? I mean, if you're good at loving and caring for your family, but you can expand that outward so that more people are brought under that umbrella, then, well, assuming you can manage that, it's very difficult. It seems to me that that's laudable. It seems to me that we spontaneously admire and would like to imitate people who are capable of that. And so you see that when you have a job or you encounter a boss who takes you under his or her wing and helps develop you, or you find a teacher who's particularly inspiring, or you work for an entrepreneur who's inspiring and who also opens doors for you. They're acting with love, as far as I'm concerned. They want the best in them to serve the best in you. And that's very, very motivating for everyone. And that's the proper basis of our social relationships, not power, for God's sake. So, can love balance out the crushing responsibility? That's a sophisticated question. I don't know the answer to that. Love is warmer than responsibility. Love is part of empathy and agreeableness. It's a different dimension than responsibility, which is more part of conscientiousness and sort of a cold virtue. I don't know if it balances out the crushing responsibility, but I think it's the emotional analog to the crushing responsibility, right? So maybe there's love and duty, and they run parallel in if you're an ethical person. That's not all there is to ethics, but love and duty, they're important, and maybe they're better together than they would be as independent entities.
So then you could imagine, I have this cottage in Northern Ontario, and we're fortunate. It's dark there, and so you can go down to the dock at night, and in the clear sky, you can see the vast array of the infinite heavens arrayed above you, you know, and it's something that people who live in cities really don't get to experience anymore. They don't experience the sunset, which we also go out on our boat and watch pretty much every day. And that puts you in touch with what inspires awe. Now, and that's not a propositional experience, that's a pre-propositional experience, and it's a deep biological experience. It's embedded in the prey response to a predator in part, you know, because if you feel awe, sometimes you can feel that with music. A lot of people who are high in openness to experience will feel that quite frequently under the effect of aesthetic experiences, interestingly enough. Their hair stands on end. That's piloerection. That's what a cat does when it's frightened by a dog, like the little boy at the beginning of the story. You know, the cat puffs up to look big, to be like meta cat, so that it can contend with dogs, or at least it can look like it might. And so when it sees a dog, the sight of the dog calls the best forth out of the cat. Well, that's what happens when you look at the night sky. You know, it calls to you, right? Dr. Dawkins sent me a paper last week in preparation for a discussion that we're going to have tomorrow. And it was a very interesting paper, and I think I read it about 25 years ago, and he said, any functioning animal has to be a microcosm, a model of the environment within which it finds itself. Well, that's true of us. And so when you look at the night sky and that sense of awe grips you and calls something out of you, right, to respond to your encounter with the infinite, even your encounter with mortality, your encounter with finitude and limitation, all of that in relationship to the infinite. That sense of awe is also the calling forth of something out of you that can respond to the challenge of that infinite. Well, that's the microcosm within. You know? It's a reflection of the structure of the cosmos itself. That's the divine ideal. And we either imitate that, or we fail to imitate that, or we pursue the opposite path. Those are the options, you know. And it's given our technological power and our capacity for wholesale atrocity, it's time we woke up and realized it.
What's the most effective way of overcoming self-deception? The problem of self-deception is extremely thorny, and it's tangled up with the issue of ignorance as well, right? How do you know when you just don't know something? And how do you know when you're being willfully blind? And how do you know when you're outright lying? All of those things are, especially to yourself, all of those things are very complicated. And so, to some degree, the answer is, well, you have to develop a philosophy of life that's detailed, that contains within it an assessment of your thoughts about the relationship between truth and deceit. So, for example, do you believe that it's okay to lie? Is it okay to deceive other people to get what you want? Are there occasions when it's okay to deceive other people if that helps them get what they want? So that would be an instance, for example, of what people perhaps call white lies, right? Lies that are designed to be of benefit. Are they appropriate? Do you feel that it's okay to deceive yourself or other people in the pursuit of things that you believe are valuable? And none of those are trivial questions, and they can't be answered with trivial answers. So to some degree, you need a moral philosophy that privileges the truth above all else if you wish to cease engaging in self-deception. And then you might ask, well, how would you develop such a philosophy? And some of that might be, well, reading about moral philosophy, reading literature, because it often deals with questions of good and evil and deception, thinking about it, writing about it, reading about it. Well, I said that. And also contemplating how central an issue this is for your life. How important is this? And why is it important if it's important? Have you lied and got into trouble? Do you believe that you can lie and get away with it? If you don't believe that you can get away with it, do you still engage in it? If so, why? All right, so let's leave the complexity behind though. But but that's a necessary part of the answer. How do you stop deceiving yourself, assuming that you want to stop doing so? Well, I don't believe that you can tell unerringly when you're telling the truth. I think that some of the time, when you lie outright, you know. And so what I would recommend, and have recommended in my writings, in my books, especially in 12 Rules for Life, the first of my last 2 books, said tell the truth, or at least don't lie. And I added that codicil to the phrase tell the truth because it became evident to me when I was writing that, I don't know the truth, certainly not in its fullness. And so I can't say to someone, tell the truth, but I can say, if you believe that the truth is valuable, and if you believe that living your life according to the dictates of the truth is for the best for you and everyone else, let's say, then you could at least stop lying. And then I would say that as you pay attention to what you say, so that you're attending to your deceptive statements and trying to stop making them. Some of them maybe outright they're not true. Some of them make you feel uneasy and weak. That would be a less evident criteria of falsehood, but still a reasonable one. You stop doing that. And then your eye for such things, or your ear for such things, or your embodied capacity to evaluate such things develops, just as everything develops with practice. And your intent, which is to maintain truth in your speech, becomes sharper and more focused across time. And perhaps you get, as you eliminate the obvious untruths, you get better and better at detecting the more subtle untruths, and better and better at avoiding being entangled with those as well. So the first issue, I guess, is the decision that it's best to live in truth. And then you have to decide how far you're willing to take that, if that becomes an absolute, for example, or if it's an important guideline, but perhaps to be superseded by other things. You have to sort that out for yourself. Once having established that, then I believe that you decide and practice not lying. And then possibly, if you're fortunate, if the world smiles on you, you'll engage in less self-deception. I guess the last thing I would add to that is that there's another form of self-deception that I wrote about in the second of my last 2 books, so the last one, Beyond Order. There's a chapter in there called Don't Hide Things in the Fog. And that really deals with self-deception too. So you might say, well, there's one form of self-deception that occurs when you say something that you know not to be true and pretend even to yourself that it's true, or even act as if it's true, or base other statements or actions on it as if it's true. But there's a more subtle form of self-deception, which I think is more pervasive, which is the unwillingness to look at, or the willingness to turn away from evidence that you know would undermine something that you want to believe, or make things inconvenient for you. I think like a cliched example is maybe someone runs a company and they have a chief financial officer, and they know that person is not exactly straight, but it's convenient not to look at the books. So maybe when they're around that person, they feel guilty and uncomfortable. And that's a sign that, something's rotten in the state of Denmark, so to speak. But then the self-deceptive act is to not look where you know you should look. And, that's the sort of thing that people refer to when they talk about the elephant under the carpet or the skeleton in the closet. And sometimes, to mix metaphors terribly, it's better to let sleeping dogs lie. But often, if you have the sense that there's something more to the story, it's painful and difficult to delve into it. But to not do so, which is the easy route, is a form of self-deception, a very common self-deception. And I don't think my experience as a clinician, and my personal experience as well, is that when you have a sense that something's up and you fail to act, you almost inevitably pay a much higher price for it at some point deferred into the future. So you have to think that through for yourself and ask yourself if you believe that's true. And if it is true, unless you want more trouble in the future, then perhaps you investigate when your moral unease, let's say, alerts you to the fact that there's something to investigate.
Wherever I go in the world, people come up to me and they're usually, I wouldn't say they're happy to see me. They're often in tears, you know, and they often have a pretty rough story to relate. You know, they were suicidal or nihilistic or homicidal or trapped, desperate, you know, and they tell me that real fast. And then they say, I've overcome that to a large degree and thank you for that. And you think, well, that's really something to have that happen over and over. In some ways, you might think, well, how could anything better possibly happen to you than to have people come up to you all over the world, strangers, and open themselves up like that, like they're old friends so quickly. But at the same time, it's an awful thing because you see, even in the revelation of their triumph, the initial depth of their despair. So I wouldn't change that, but it's not nothing. And it's certainly not just happiness. It's better than happiness, but it's almost unbearable.
At the end of God's creation, describing how order emerges from chaos or being from potential, there's this strange line, which is probably the most important line that's ever been written in our culture, at the basis of our culture. And that is that men and women are made in the image of God. And what does that mean? Well, if God is that which confronts potential with truth and courage and makes what's good out of potential, that seems to indicate that we have the same faculty. Like on a smaller scale, we're not omniscient, but we're not bloody well nothing. Our conscience is integrally tied into the structure of being in some manner we don't understand. And it certainly is the case that we take what isn't and turn it into what is. That's something, man. That's quite the trick we've been able to manage. And so we're made in that image. And so what are we supposed to do? Well, that's what we're supposed to do. We're supposed to type our letters and make our phrases and construct our sentences and build our paragraphs and put our chapters together and make our books and communicate to people and straighten out the damn culture and constrain the malevolence and ignorance that besets each of us and push nature back and extend ourselves out into the unknown and confront the potential that's there in illimitable quantities and make the world better than it could be otherwise. To move it away from hell, and it can certainly become that, and toward heaven to the degree that we can manage that. And that is a good enough goal. That's the thing. You need something, you know, because your life is tough. It's hard. You need something that, you know, you need something to get out of bed for and fight for. And that's something, right? To fight, let's say, against hell and for heaven. That's something to fight for. You want to be convinced about this. Like, read a little bit about hell. Read the Gulag Archipelago, or read Ordinary Men, or read The Rape of Nanking, or read about what happened in Nazi Germany during Auschwitz and all the catastrophes of the 20th century, and see if you believe in hell, and see if you think, well, maybe not having that happen anymore would be a good idea. And then think about maybe that's something you could contribute to. Then it wouldn't have to happen anymore. And that would be a good thing, and God only knows what great things we could manage under such conditions. We're becoming incredibly technologically powerful. What would it be like if we became equally wise? Well, that would really be something. God only knows what we could manage in the next 20 years or the next 100 years, you know? We're running at 40%, most of us, you know, because we're half in and half out. And it's not surprising, because life is difficult. It's like, well, what if you were 90% in, or 95% in, or all in? Because you're all in anyways, right? It's a life and death game. No one gets out of this. Everyone dies. You might as well commit yourself. And you might as well commit yourself to the highest good that you can attain, because why not? It'll imbue your life with meaning. It's hard, the responsibility's there, but all the meaning's in the responsibility, and that'll make your life better. It'll make your family's life better, and it should make your culture better. Maybe it make the world better. It's like, that'll justify your damn miserable existence at 3 o'clock in the morning when you're wondering what the hell you're doing here. And that's a good thing, because there's going to be days when you're aching and tired and sore, and there's people in your family that are sick, and you're cynical and bitter, and you need a reason to get up, and you think, yeah, well, a little more heaven and a little less hell, maybe I can pull that off today and tomorrow and next week. And that's worth struggling forward for. And so that's how it looks to me. My rule too is treat yourself as if you're someone responsible for helping, and it's sort of predicated on the idea that regardless of your inadequacies and your malevolence, which, you know, I'm sure you have many inadequacies and no shortage of malevolence, just like everyone else. Regardless of that, you have a moral obligation, so that would be a responsibility, to assume that despite all evidence, that there's actually something of intrinsic worth about you, and that as a consequence, you're duty bound to treat yourself like that is true. And then it turns out that if you do that, well, then your life gets better. And I don't mean happier exactly, although I would say it gets happier. I mean it gets richer and more meaningful and deeper and more worthwhile, and you become more educated and you become wiser, and you treat yourself with more respect, and you're a better model for other people, and you're a better father or better sister or better mother, whatever it happens to be. And you're less ridden by that guilt that gnaws at you, and shame that's there otherwise saying, you're not what you could be, you're not what you could be. And that's a hell of a voice to get rid of, and it's certainly not one that's easy to ignore. So that's a pretty good, that idea that there's something divine, let's say, that resides within you of ultimate worth. Even as a philosophical statement or a psychological statement rather than a metaphysical statement, it seems to be a precondition for establishing properly harmonious relationships with yourself. And that's worth thinking about a lot, you know, that you have, because you could think that in some sense you just own yourself, you know, because people do kind of make that claim, especially when they're trying to justify, for example, their right to suicide, that, you know, it's your life, it's your body, you're yours to do what you will with. And if that was true, well, then it would seem to me that life would be a lot more straightforward, because you would just tell yourself things that you would instantly obey and believe. So first of all, you'd tell yourself all the things that you were going to do, and then you just run off and do them, which you don't, obviously, because it's much more difficult than that. And then you'd also say, well, enough of the guilt and the shame and the negative emotion and the disillusionment and the vengefulness and all those things that make life hard, especially the self-recrimination. It's like, what the hell do we need that for? And if we're our masters of our own destiny and owners of our own fate, then why can't we just command to ourselves that be dispensed with? And like, that doesn't work. I've never seen anybody able to do that. So, I mean, you can fool yourself for very brief periods of time into thinking that might work, but it doesn't work. And that's strange. And this is one of the reasons I love the psychoanalysts, because they were really the people, apart from the religious types, who figured out that whatever you are, you're not a unitary spirit that's under your own dominion. You know, you're something like a loose unity of a multiplicity of spirits, many of which are doing their own thing, which you're striving to bring into some form of unity. But even that unity isn't something that's under your control in any real sense. It's a unity that has its own nature that you have to exist in relationship to. And I would also say that that's one of the things that keeps people's feet firmly on the ground, because otherwise it's easy to become egotistical and narcissistic. You know, if you think that you're the center of your own being, you know, in some fundamental sense, then you're only beholden to yourself. You're sort of a self-created creature. Perhaps you could think about it that way. But
it doesn't work like that. It's like the ideal that constitutes the unity that you might become then sort of manifests itself as something that you could strive toward but aren't. And it also serves as a judge. It's the thing that keeps you up at night saying, you know, there's some things you're just not attending to, and you should get at it because life is short and there's no shortage of trouble that you might end up in, and a wise person would attend to the dictates of his conscience and lay out his actions in the world according to what he knows to be true and correct. And that is how people think. And it isn't obvious that why we think that way. This is part of the reason that it seems to me so obvious that we have a religious instinct, because I can't think of what else you would possibly call that other than a religious instinct.
The notion that our morality is linked to our desire to survive I'm perfectly fine with that. The devil's in the details to some degree. I mean, one of the fields of endeavor that I've been particularly struck by is the work of people like Frans de Waal. And Frans de Waal has written a series, and also Jaak Panksepp. Hey, I'll tell you something cool about rats. Some of you, I'd like to do that. Some of you have probably heard this before, but this affective neuroscientist named Jaak Panksepp, he studied rats for a long time, and he's a very sophisticated researcher, and I think he was one of the greatest neuroscientists who lived in the last 50 years. I don't think there's really any question of that. He might have been one of the top three. He'd be in the top three. It'd be a tight race up at the top three. He did this great experiment. It was so smart. So, juvenile rats like to play, and they like to wrestle. They like to engage in rough and tumble play. And you might say, well, how do you know a rat likes to do something? It's like, or you're anthropomorphizing. And the first thing I would say to that is you should anthropomorphize unless there's evidence to the contrary, because we share a biological platform with rats, and they're a lot like us. And a rat is a lot more like you than your stupid model of a human being is like a human being. So you try building a rat. It's hard. So anyways, you can tell rats want to play because if you put them in a little arena where they can rough and tumble play and wrestle, and then you bring them there the next time and you make them work to open the door to play, they'll work. And so that's how we know you like something. You'll work for it, you know. So you can apply that to rats, and they'll work hard for it. And rats deprived of play, their prefrontal cortexes don't mature. And they're kind of hyperactive, which might tell us something about boys in school, but we won't go into that. If you take a rat of the same age as another rat and you put him in a play area, but the other rat has a 10% weight advantage, the big rat will pin the little rat. And they actually pin each other, pretty much like dogs do when they're wrestling. Well, they don't pin quite as much, but humans certainly do it. And pin means dominance, or that's one interpretation. You only make that interpretation if you think that the hierarchies that rats live in are dominance hierarchies predicated on the expression of power. And we all kind of think that because we use the term dominance hierarchy. But, you know, that's a political term as well as a scientific term, and it's predicated on the notion that the fundamental basis of hierarchical structure among mammals and other complex organisms is power, and that's wrong. And it's not just wrong, it's corrosively wrong. It's misleadingly wrong. It's seriously and not acceptably wrong. Anyways, you pair the rats once and you think, hey, big rat wins over little rat, establishes dominance, that's the basis of the relationship. But the thing about rats is, like people, they don't just play once because they live in social groups that are reciprocal. They play repeatedly. And Panksepp, being a very smart researcher, realized this, so he paired rats to play, the same rats, over multiple occasions. And the first thing he observed was the second time the rats got together, the little rat had to invite the big rat to play. You know, and rats do the same sort of thing that dogs do when they want to play. And that play behavior is so cross-species common that all of you know when your dog wants to play. You know, you can take your dog and whack him like that if you do it right. And
he goes "Rawr," and tries to bite you, but not really, right? He plays and his tail's wagging. And when dogs are playing, it kind of looks like dominance behavior, like it does among boys, because boys really like to rough and tumble play, by the way, although girls like it too, but not as much. You can distinguish the play behavior from aggression, and if you can't, that means you never had any friends. I mean that. I mean that. That's what it means. That's what it means, because part of being able to have friends is to be able to identify aggression versus play. And part of playing is to pretend to be aggressive quite aggressively, but still be playing, right? There's a tremendous social skill in that. Anyways, the little rat has to ask the big rat to play, which I imagine is somewhat, humiliating for the little rat, but he's the little rat, so tough luck for him. And the big rat can deign to play, and then they play. And then you can observe how they play over repeated bouts. If the big rat doesn't let the little rat win at least 30% of the time, even though he could win 100% of the time, the little rat will no longer invite him to play. And you think, yeah. It's like, no, not yeah. Like the emergence of morality in rats through play. That's a big discovery, man. That's a big discovery. And there's that reciprocity, that exists within the rat hierarchy. And stable hierarchies in complex mammals are not predicated on power. So Frans de Waal has showed quite clearly that, so chimps have a pretty rough hierarchy, and it's pretty male-dominated. Now, bonobos are quite different. We won't talk about them because it's not germane to this particular point. But you might think, the biggest chimpanzee with the biggest teeth, he's the tyrant. He's the winner. And that happens sometimes. There are tyrannical chimpanzee societies. But what de Waal has shown quite clearly is that I don't care how big and tough you are. If you don't play fair, two guys 90% your size can get together one day when you're not feeling so well and tear you into bits. And that's exactly what happens among the chimps. So tyranny, that can be a route to dominance. It can even be a route to sexual access, because it is the case among chimpanzees that males who are higher in the power hierarchy are more likely to father offspring, not because the female chimps choose them, because female chimps aren't choosy, unlike human females. It's a profound difference between the two species, but because that more superordinate male chimps chase the subordinates away. So, but de Waal has shown quite clearly that the males who manage to occupy positions of authority and competence longest in chimpanzee hierarchies are intensely reciprocal with the other males, more so than the other chimps in the hierarchy. They do a lot of mutual grooming and are preferentially attentive to the females and their infants. And so even among chimps, and chimps can be damn brutal, right? Jane Goodall discovered, I think it was 1975, another landmark in late 20th century science, that, and this was a real blow to the social constructionist utopians. Juvenile chimps patrol the borders of their territory, and if they come across chimps from other troops and outnumber them, they will tear them into bits. And chimps are unbelievably strong, and it's unbelievably brutal. And so Goodall basically discovered that chimps have the human the equivalent of human tribal warfare. And that's quite frightening if you're sensible, because, you might be the kind of optimist who thinks that human conflict is caused by capitalism or some bloody daft notion like that. And wouldn't that be lovely? Because then it would be, you could just get rid of it by getting rid of capitalism, which you wouldn't be able to do anyways, but you know what I mean. We split from chimps about 7 million years ago, and if the problem of intergroup aggression is that deep, it's a terrible problem. And this is another thing you can do in your own household. This is so useful, man. If you get good at doing this, your life will get so much better. You can't believe it. Is watch the people around you
And whenever they do anything that you would like to see repeated on a regular basis, tell them exactly what they did in detail, with, be positive about it, obviously, and just indicate that you noticed. And because I saw this when I was grading student essays, and so I taught this seminar for a long time, and I was trying to teach kids how to write. They were in their 4th year of university in the honors psych program. You'd think they'd bloody well already know how to write, but they didn't. And so I'd have them write a 4-page essay on a given topic, and then they had to rewrite that to a 6-page essay, and then they had to rewrite that to an 8-page essay. And the first essay I graded, it was only 5% of their grade, and I told them, I'm going to cut you into ribbons, but it doesn't matter because it's 5% of your grade, and so they could tolerate that. And generally, by the 3rd essay, they had written the best thing they'd ever written in their life, and they learned so fast it was unbelievable. But one of the things I noticed was that they did a little testing with the first essay. They'd hand in something, it was just like, God, formulaic, boring. They weren't in it at all, There was nothing of the person in there. There was no thought. There was just the kind of psychobabble that they'd learned, especially if they were in faculties of education. And it was dry and dull, and everything about it was wrong. And so those are hard to grade, right? It's like, what's wrong with my essay? Well, the words aren't right. The phrases, they're not so good. They're not organized well into sentences. The sentences aren't sequenced well in the paragraphs. The paragraphs don't make a coherent argument, and the entire thing is empty. But other than that, no problem. It was often easier just to rewrite those essays than to grade them. So in any case, though, one of the things I did learn was that even in an essay like that, there is usually like 1 sentence or 2 sentences buried on like page 3 that was an actual thought and reasonably clearly stated and somewhat gripping, It was like the person popped out from all the background rubbish and said, well, what about this? And if you saw that and checked it and said, hey, you hit the mark right there, the next essay would be like 2/3 that. And that was really fun to see. And then maybe by the 3rd essay, maybe it was all like that. And then they were really thrilled. It's like, wow, I wrote this, And it was sort of the culmination. Well, it was a 4th year seminar. It was the culmination of their career as a psychology undergraduate. So that was great fun. But you can do that in your own household. If the envious part of you isn't jealous of the revelation of the goodness of the person.
For me, as a clinical psychologist, I've always looked at things, I think, in some ways from the opposite perspective of most, and maybe even most psychologists. It's never been a mystery to me why people are depressed. It's never been a mystery to me why people are anxious and unsettled. It seems obvious why they're concerned and hurt and anxious and unsettled. I think the mystery is how it is that we can conduct ourselves so that can remain under control. I mean, people deal with very heavy burdens in their life. You don't have to talk to someone for very long. Someone you might be thinking is doing quite well in the world, and sometimes people are. But you don't have to scratch very deep beneath the surface before you find out that they have a family member who has a serious illness, or someone who's suffering through an economic crisis of one form or another, or who there's some source of genuine tragedy 1 degree removed from them, if it's even removed. And most people, even as individuals, have at least one serious problem that they're dealing with. And so it's no mystery that people find it difficult to orient themselves in the world. And the mystery is, well, what can you do about it? And we do know what you can do about it. And Jonathan Haidt wrote a book recently. Now, I'm afraid that it's the name of the book has escaped me. It's about the college situation and the snowflake culture. And one of the things that he pointed out, along with Luginov, who's his co-author, was that if you're a psychotherapist of any sort, particularly a behavior therapist, what you help people do is to
identify their problems. That's the first thing, is to confront what's there, the reality of what's there, as bluntly as possible. And so you often end up as a psychotherapist talking to people about their array of problems. It's as if they're putting their cards on the table. And you sort out their problems. It's like, and no, they often decide that many of the things that are bothering them are not really that important. They can wait, but that there are crucial life challenges that present themselves to them. And they're not just psychological problems, although sometimes they are. They're problems in life, right? Existential problems. And then what you do is you help people break them down into manageable units, let's say, strategically, and confront them voluntarily. You know, and there's an echo of that idea. There's an echo of that in Christian thinking, and the echo for that is to pick up your cross voluntarily, which is that you have an unavoidable mortal burden to bear in life. There's no escape from it, except to directly confront it and to take it on voluntarily. And what's so fascinating about that, two things. One is that psychotherapists of every stripe understand that this is one of the primary reasons that psychotherapy works. There's no dispute about that among all the different psychotherapeutic schools, is that the confrontation of existential problems, voluntary confrontation, is curative. And that's really something. And so, and the practical aspect of that is quite straightforward. It also indicates, practical and philosophical, it also indicates to you that there's far more to you than you think. Because it turns out that you have substantial problems, genuine, deep problems of malevolence and suffering. But that if you decide that you will take that on as your responsibility, that you can put yourself together psychologically, just the courage, and you can actually solve the problems. And that seems to be true. It's not a naive wish. It seems to be well within our capacity. And I mean, that's part of the message, I would say, of 12 Rules for Life, is that dark as things are, there's more light in you than you know what to do with, and there's more light in you than you can possibly manifest. And the way to find that out is to challenge yourself against these massive problems, and to find out that you're the one that can deal with them. I don't know how many of you have read Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment, but I would highly recommend that. In Crime and Punishment, the protagonist commits the perfect murder, and he has his reasons for it, and many reasons, because Dostoevsky didn't mess around. When he wanted to give someone reasons, he gave them reasons, and Raskolnikov, the main character, had reasons for murder, and then he commits his murder, and he gets away with it. But things don't go well for Raskolnikov, because one of the things he finds out is that the Raskolnikov that you were before you committed the murder is not the same as the Raskolnikov as you are after you've committed the murder. And there's a dividing line there that you don't, it's like the red pill, I guess, right? It's that's the Matrix, correct? The red pill. And once there's certain actions, once you take them, there's no going back. And so that's what Crime and Punishment is about. And Raskolnikov tortures himself to death, well, not literally, but metaphysically, psychologically, because he cannot tolerate breaking the great moral code. And so it's a great book. It's truly a great book. And it's also extraordinarily, like it's a murder mystery thriller as well as being a deep philosophical book. So if you're in the mood for, a murder mystery thriller that's also a deep philosophical book, then that's the one for you.
You need that instinct for meaning too. So, and we should get this real straight. Why do you need it? Well, you need it because life is really, really difficult, right? I mean, people have a rough time of it. There's plenty of suffering in life, and everyone is going to encounter it, right? You learn this as a clinical psychologist, and you know this generally, unless you're an extraordinarily fortunate person. You don't have to talk to someone for very long. and really talk to them and get beneath the surface until you find, there's a tragedy or 2 or 3 or 10 lurking not very far beneath the surface. Someone in the family is very ill. There's a childhood history of extreme pathology, alcoholism somewhere in the family, maybe a touch of insanity. Someone has cancer, an older relative is dying. There's financial trouble. There's economic trouble. There's marital trouble. It's like life is trouble. And now, that doesn't mean it's all trouble, but man, it's trouble. And sometimes it's a lot of trouble. And sometimes it's so much trouble that you can barely stand it. And you see that because people get depressed and they commit suicide. And the reason they do that is because they think not being is better than being. And that's quite the decision, So, and it's not that uncommon among people who are depressed. And so it's a very important thing to consider. And it isn't just a matter of depression and suicide. That's bad enough. But, if you're unhappy because your suffering has pushed you past the point of your ability to cope, then there's all sorts of other things that can happen to you that aren't directed towards you. You can become cynical, and you can become bitter, and you can become cruel, and you can become narcissistic and deceitful and arrogant. And it's like everything's for you. And then you're out for revenge. That's a nice one. I don't know against who, but maybe everyone. Maybe even including you, because you're not happy about the role you've played in generating your own misery. I mean, there's a lot of darkness underneath the suffering. And so, and that's an ever-present existential danger for human beings, We're aware of the future, we're aware of our fragility, we're aware of our mortality. It's something that makes us truly unique, truly conscious in a way that no other creature is, and capable of things that no other creature can do, but also bearing an unbelievably heavy existential load. We're the only creatures that have to always contend with the fact that we're finite and that everyone we know is in the same position, that allied with the suffering. And so that's there all the time. And even in the brightest moments, in some sense, in Renaissance paintings, in still lifes, they used to put a memento mori often in the still life, like a skull somewhere in the corner, or sometimes in a very strange perspective, so that you could only see the skull if you were standing like right beside the painting instead of dead on. But the idea was to always remember, that everything that exists is tainted or touched with the taint of mortality. And that's rough, but there's some useful things in it. It keeps you awake and it keeps you focused if you're careful. But it also does indicate to you, if you think about it, the necessity of having a meaning in your life. Because if it's true intrinsically that life has this unbearable element of suffering, which seems to be completely in what would you say, indisputable as far as I'm concerned, and it's worse than that too, because it's not just suffering, it's suffering contaminated with malevolence, right? It's bad enough to have something bad happen to you, and it's likely that that'll happen. But it's even worse for you to do it to yourself and to know that you did it. That's rough. And it's also extraordinarily rough to be betrayed by someone else or, tyrannized by your own culture. And that's not just suffering. That's like unnecessary and pointless suffering that's been directed at you by something that wants that to happen. And so both of those are very, very powerful, let's say, archetypal forces, suffering and malevolence, and we have to deal with them at every level of reality. And you need something to push back against that. It's not optional, if that's the default position, and I think it's the default position. Like, a meaningless life isn't meaningless. It's suffering and malevolence. That's not good. And if that's acted out, that's the other thing. If that's acted out, and I've read the accounts and the actions of people who've taken a very vicious turn into the darkest parts of the underworld, consequence of their resentment and their malevolence, and then their desire to make everything in the world suffer for the outrage of its existence, man. I mean, that's how we turn things into hell. If you want to know why totalitarian states take the brutal twists they take and why people are motivated to do the absolutely terrible things that they do, well, that's why, is that the suffering and the malevolence that's intrinsic to life overwhelms them, and they turn in a very bad direction, and then they make everything that's already bad way worse, and we're very, very inventive at such things. And so that's not good, unless that's the path you want. That's a bad idea. You need an alternative, and that's meaning.
Part of the cultural battle that we all find ourselves enveloped in is partially due to the claim that there's virtually nothing other than the lust for power. And, you know, I would say, fair enough, in some limited sense, that bears directly on your question, because you see that as a temptation that might be powerful enough to bend and distort you as you attempt to make your way through, let's say, the halls of power. Well, I heard recently from a reliable source that Putin's conversion to Orthodox Christianity might be genuine. And then you might think, well, if you're atheistic, well, that's not necessarily a good thing, or maybe you think it's a bad thing, or maybe you think it's an irrelevant issue, and you may also think it's a lie. But I would say that I would be more inclined to trust someone who thinks there's something higher than himself. And then you might say, well, what is it that's higher than ourselves? And that's worth thinking about. And we all need to think about this, regardless of the particulars of our religious belief. And I would say, again, from a clinical perspective, service to others is really something. People who are depressed tend to use the pronouns I and me much more frequently than people who aren't depressed. And I'm not saying that people get depressed because they're selfish. I'm not saying that at all. I'm saying that one of the routes out of depression appears to be an increase in service to other people. And I think the reason for that is because we aren't power-mad demons at the core, even though we may be tempted by such things, and that we find the genuine meaning that offsets genuine suffering in the genuine service to others. And I think it's a big mistake to be cynical, especially prematurely, about such things as political activity, because they're necessary, despite, let's say, their adversarial and party-centered nature, partisan nature. You have to be clear about what you serve and why. And that has to be held higher always than mere victory, mere operationalized victory or instrumental victory. And it's a very, very difficult thing to negotiate, particularly because in the political realm, in some sense, you have to defeat your enemy, right? Because you have to win the election and the other people have to lose. It's a binary choice. But so often I see in partisan discussion the proclivity to assume that all the ill will and malevolence resides on the other side of the chamber. And that's a big mistake. And you could think about that more deeply too, is that we all need a place to place the existence of malevolence, right? Because malevolence clearly exists, and we all suffer from the weight of malevolent history, right? Because even the grounds we walk on here, which this is a remarkable and wonderful place, I mean, English soil is soaked with blood, just like the soil of every place in the world. That's part of the human heritage, and all of us bear the marks of that conflict in some sense in our souls, partly because of the possibility for us to engage in that, but also partly because part of the reason we're here in all this privilege is because of all that catastrophe. Well, the best way to localize that malevolence is inside you, right? And to remember that the enemy that you're fighting with, the greatest enemy that you ever fight with, is in your own heart. And that'll also stop you from confusing that true source of malevolence, let's say, with your mere political enemies. And that isn't to say that you won't encounter malevolent behavior, although most of it in the political sphere, as it is everywhere, most of it is more ignorance than malevolence, although willful blindness certainly plays a large role. And so you need to know what it is that you're serving. And I would say one of the ways to do that practically, or a couple of ways to do that practically, is you need a good team around you, the people you really trust and who can watch you, and who do it with a certain degree of impartiality, and who are disagreeable enough to talk to you when you do something wrong. So you need trusted advisors. And then the other thing I would say is you really need to listen to your constituents, because they will tell you what the problems are if you listen to them. And if you really listen to them, well, then you'll have your feet on the ground, which is where they should be, and you'll know what the problems are, and you will win elections. Because what people really want from their leaders is to be listened to, and then for those leaders to articulate what they've heard in the halls of, let's say, influence and power. And so if you know those things, if you know you need to listen, you need to get in touch with the people you're representing as regularly as you possibly can, and mostly to listen. I knew a man in Canada who started a political party, which is a very difficult thing to do. And not only did he start it, but he rode it to sufficient success so that he became the leader of the opposition in Canada within about 10 years. And I asked him how he did that, because it's like, well, really, how did you do that? That's actually really hard. And he said he would go out from constituency to constituency and make his stump speeches, but what he really liked was the Q&As, because people would tell him what their problems were. Then he knew what the problems were. And out of the dialogue would also emerge the answers that the audience found compelling. And so not only would they tell him what the problems were, but they would tell him the answers they would like to have what instituted to solve those problems. It's the same thing that comedians do when they finesse their acts in front of live audiences before they practice them in front of a large audience. They tell jokes, and the audience either laughs or they don't. And if they laugh, then you keep that joke, and if they don't, you throw it out. And soon you're just as funny as the audience can possibly manage. And it's the same thing. You can also do that in a dark manner, by the way, which is what Hitler did. So he could utter terrible things and wait for a response and collect those. And so then you become the embodiment of the shadow of your people. So I would recommend that you probably don't do that.
You speak about the concept of the soul. Do you associate this with any psychological constructs?
Not any psychological constructs that are more valid than the notion of the soul. No, there's, I would say, what we mean by soul is something like animating spirit. And you might say, well, what's a spirit? And well, that's actually rather easy to answer. So when a child of 4 is playing house, let's say when a child of 4 is playing house, she acts out the role of the mother. But acting out, that's a strange thing, right? Because she doesn't literally duplicate in her actions or her perceptions in the game what she observed her mother literally doing. So, for example, she didn't go into her mother's bedroom when her mother awoke and watched her turn her head in a particular way to awaken and count the number of blinks so that she could mimic that in her play. And, you think that's absurd, but it's not absurd if it's just mimicry. It's not. It's unbelievably sophisticated. So what the girl does is she watches her mother manifest maternal behavior across a vast array of instances, and she integrates that with the image of the mother she's received from all the books she's been read and all the little movies she's watched, the Disney movies and so forth, and she abstracts out the animating principle of the maternal, and then she embodies that in play, and usually with a little boy, and that's practice for what's going to come later. It's unbelievably sophisticated, and she's embodying a spirit, and the spirit there is the abstraction of the central animating principle from multiple embodiments of its manifestation. And if you think children can't do that, well, then you don't know anything about children, because they do that all the time in their pretend play, which is a necessary precursor to healthy psychological development. And so part of what we refer to as the soul is the presence of that spirit, or maybe even the capacity of embodying such spirits. And it's very difficult to know how deep that goes. I had a vision at one point of all the men in my life who've been particularly influential in a benevolent way. And you think, well, just the mere notion of the idea that there could be a benevolent way that would unite the acts of benevolence across a series of men, that's all comprehensible to you. You take that as a matter of course when you say that there are such things as good men, and you can identify them, right? Something stable about whatever is good across multiple manifestations of incarnation, let's say. And I saw that transform into the Father person of the Trinity as the embodiment of that benevolent spirit. Now, I don't have any idea what that means metaphysically, because who does? But that spirit manifesting itself within is certainly part of what we refer to when we talk about the soul. And you can see that shine through people, I mean, it's part of what gives someone charisma. It's part of what elicits the instinct to imitate in you. You know, and you see that even in simple things. When you see a remarkable athlete do something incredibly athletic to put the soccer ball, the football ball through the net, to score the goal, and everybody leaps to their feet in celebration of that, well, that's a celebration of the divine capacity to hit the target dead on. And it grips you at such a low level, way down inside your soul, that you're compelled to your feet to cheer, and you don't even know what you're doing. But you enjoy it, that's for sure. And that enjoyment is also a sign of the depth and utility of that response. You see this in all the things that people do that are, so-called popular entertainment. It's unbelievably sophisticated. The soul is participating in that in the fullest extent. And, you can say, well, there's no necessary use for the religious terminology. It's like, well, until you come up with a better word, there's plenty of use for it, because it's a very complex and deep phenomena. And to, just cast it into the realm of superstition in some casual manner it's just not helpful. Not in any possible. It's not helpful scientifically. It's not helpful ethically. It's not helpful existentially. Try treating someone for a while as if they don't have a soul. Just really, I mean it. Just, treat them like a deterministic machine, if that's your belief. Really act it out. You'll be like the most hated person in town in about 15 minutes. Well, I mean, what do you make of practical evidence like that? I mean, you interact with people as if they're free souls capable of choosing between good and evil. That's what you do all the time. And maybe you can addle yourself out of that by some ridiculous rationalist ideology, but that just means you're kind of a gabbling fool, and it's just going to make you trip over things you don't even notice in all of your social interactions. And you tell me, I don't care how you think philosophically or ideologically, you bloody well know that what I just said is true. So, and that's true even when you're interacting with an infant or a small child. It's true when you're dealing with someone who's elderly and virtually incapacitated in every way. You still see that divine spark, for lack of a better term, and we do lack a better term, by the way. You see that everywhere if your eyes are open and if you're willing to see it, and to the degree that you're responsive to that, then your actions are guided by love and your words are guided by truth.
Human consciousness is that faculty that confronts potential itself. I think there's good neurological evidence for this, by the way, for those of you who are scientifically minded, because we build circuits within us for habitual action that we've practiced many times that seem to run in a very deterministic fashion. And we are a strange combination of deterministic and non-deterministic as far as I can tell. But what our consciousness seems to be for is to encounter those things that we have not yet encountered. And those things that we have not yet encountered seem to me to be those things that have not yet been brought into being. And so you could say that what our consciousness is for the encounter with potential. That our consciousness is it's not for the past, it's not even for the present. It's to transform the future into the present. And really that's what our consciousness does. When you wake up in the morning, you have a new day ahead of you, and the day could take you in very many directions. And the weeks and the years, all of that can take you in very many directions. And you have some apprehension about what those directions might be. You have some apprehension about what role your choices might make in transforming that potential into one form of actuality or another. I mean, you certainly know that there are dreadful mistakes that you might be very tempted to make that would produce all manner of hell around you and still be tempted to do it. It seems like it's sitting there right in front of you as a possibility. You also know that, you could haul yourself up out of bed and attend to your duties and do the sorts of things that you're supposed to and set a few things right that day and that week, and that likely things would at least not be worse, and they would probably be better. And I do believe that I don't understand how this can be the case. I don't understand how it is that consciousness can function in that way, because I think to understand that, we would have to understand what it means for the future to be only potential rather than actuality, and who the hell understands that? I mean, no one. And then we'd have to understand how it is that our conscious choices and our conscious ethical choices transform that potentiality into actuality, into reality, into the present and the past. And we certainly act as if we believe that that's what we do. We upbraid ourselves. For example, when we do a bad job of it, we're upset with our children and those we love if we don't believe that they're living up to their potential. We're guilty and ashamed when we make choices that we feel are inappropriate. We understand to some degree that the manner in which time lays itself out has something to do with the ethics of our choice. And again, I would say that's a very deep idea. I think it's the most true idea I know. It's very emphasized, that idea emphasized in ancient religious stories such as those that are outlined in Genesis, or in Genesis with its strange insistence that, God is that which brings order out of chaos, formless potential, generates the world out of formless potential, and that we're somehow made in that image, which seems to me to be the case. And that the proper way, by the way, to go about acting in that image is to act in relationship to the potential that confronts you with truth and with courage, with careful articulation. That's the logos. And that if you do that, then what you bring forth is good. There's a gospel saying, which is, of course, impossible to comprehend or believe. Knock and the door will open, ask and you will receive, seek and you will find. And people think, well, no way, the world's not constituted like that. It's like, it goes back to the idea of aim. If you don't aim at it, you're not going to hit it. And it might also go back to a question about what do you mean by ask and what do you mean by want? Because it isn't just some casual request. You're praying to God, I wish I could find my wallet or something like that, as if he's the casual granter of magical wishes, like a fairy with a magic wand. It's not that. Asking means something like this: I am willing to give up everything that I'm doing wrong so that I can put things right, if I could know what right was. And that's you're on your knees when you say that, man. And maybe if you're on your knees, you get the answer. And so that's what we're thinking about. So, if you knocked and you wanted to walk through and you asked and you wanted to learn, and you sought because you wanted to find, maybe you would receive and be answered and find, but not without aim.
If you don't have some notion of the divine, then you'll believe any damn thing.
Yeah.
Right?
I think that's right.
And that's what the kids are doing.
Yeah, well, Dostoevsky's comment on that was, if there's no God, everything is permitted. And he did a lovely job of analyzing that in Crime and Punishment and the Brothers Karamazov. And I think it's true. I think if you believe nothing, you'll fall for anything. And I really do believe that's the case. And, you might say, well, what do you mean? You mentioned earlier that people like to ask me if I believe in God. And I always think, well, who are you to be asking that question? First of all, you have some notion of what you mean by believe that you think is just accurate because you know what believe means. And so you have a priori theory about belief. And now you're asking me if my belief in God fits into your a priori theory. It's how about we start by questioning your a priori theory of belief? Because I don't even know what you mean by believe, and neither do you. Especially when we're asking a question that profound. Because, do you believe in God? There's two mysteries there. Well, three. You believe God. All three of those are subject to question. I think people act out what they believe. And so when people ask me if I believe in God, I say generally that I act as if God exists, or I try to act as if God exists. And they're not very happy about that because they want me to abide by the implicit rules of their question, which is no, do you believe in the religious view as a pseudoscientific description of the structure of reality? It's like, well, I don't even know how to answer that question because it's so badly formulated, I can't get a handle on it. Do you believe that there's something divine? Well, let's try to define divine. Here, we can do that for a moment. Most of us have some sense that literary stories differ in their depth. I don't think that's an unwarranted proposition. Some stories are shallow and some stories are deep. Some stories are ephemeral and some move you deeply, whatever that means. It's a metaphor, but we understand what it means. Imagine there are layers of literary depth. And one way of conceptualizing the layers of literary depth is that the deeper an idea is, the more other ideas depend on it. Right? And so you have fundamental ideas that are fundamental because if you shake that idea, you shake all the ideas that are dependent on them. And then I would say, well, the realm of the divine is the realm of the most fundamental ideas. And you don't get to believe in that or not, because the alternative is to say, well, all ideas are equal in value. It's like, okay, well, try acting then. And you can't, because you can't act unless you prioritize your beliefs. And if you prioritize them, you arrange them into a hierarchy. And if you arrange them into a hierarchy, you accept the notion of depth. And so that's a no-go. When we use language of the divine, we're talking about the deepest ideas. And so I believe that the notion that each individual is characterized by a consciousness that transforms the horizon of the future into the present, that's a divine idea. It's so deep. And our cultures necessarily, I think functional cultures are necessarily predicated on that idea. So I don't just think it's a Western idea. I don't think you can have a functional culture that in some sense doesn't instantiate that idea, because you interfere with the mechanism of adaptation itself by not allowing it free expression. You know, and you can be like my prime minister and you can say, well, I really admire the Chinese Communist Party because when it comes to environmental issues, they get things done. And I think I couldn't begin to tell you how many things are wrong with that statement. It would take like 15 years to tell you why you're an inexcusably narcissistic idiot. But we can start like simply. If you know what you're doing and you have power, if you know what you're doing, maybe you can be more efficient in your exercise of, in your control over movement towards that goal. Let's just assume for a minute that you do know what you're doing. Well, maybe if you have power, then you're efficient. Fair enough, man. What about when you don't know what you're doing? How about then? Where do you turn? Because what that means is your ideology failed you. And do you have a mechanism for operating when you don't know what you're doing? Well, no, because we always know what we're doing because we're totalitarian and we have a complete theory of everything. And don't say anything to the contrary or else. We've got it all wrapped up. Yeah, except when you don't. And so what do we do in free societies when we don't know what we're doing? Well, we let people talk. And out of that babble, out of that noise, and American culture is particularly remarkable in this regard, you have this immense diversity of opinions, most of which are completely useless, and some of which are absolutely redemptive. And one of the things that's so remarkable as a Canadian observing your culture in particular is that, you know, you guys veer off in weird directions fairly frequently and things look pretty unstable, and then there's some glimmer of hope somewhere that bursts forward in a whole new mode of adaptation, and away you go again. And that just happens over and over and over. And that's a consequence of real diversity. And it's definitely a consequence of like freedom of association and freedom of speech, because it enables all that.
You're at a crossroads, right? You're entering a new phase of your life. You're someone different than you were 4 years ago, and hopefully someone better. Likely someone better. And you have another opportunity now to be the next iteration of yourself that you can be. At a crossroads, you know, the metaphor works because you make a decision. You go one direction or another. And there's an old blues idea that you meet the devil at the crossroads. And I always wondered why that was. I thought it through. It's a really compelling idea. You know, it's an image that has a good narrative fit and it sticks in your memory once you hear it. Why do you meet the devil at the crossroads at midnight? Maybe that's when you examine your conscience, or it examines you. And then you might ask, well, why do you meet the devil at the crossroads? And the answer is, most fundamentally, because when you come to a place in your life where you have to make a choice, and I think this is actually true of every choice we ever make, but it's more evident when the choice is more weighty, let's say. as the choices that lay themselves out now in front of you are weighty, you aim up or down. And there is always an agent of temptation at every choice point enticing you to aim down. And I've thought a lot about what aiming down means, and so I'll run through that for a bit. The spirit of temptation, it manifests itself, for example, in the story of Cain and Abel. And so Cain falls prey to temptation, and God bluntly informs him when he complains about his fate that the temptation was freely chosen and that he could have done differently and better. And Cain becomes, this is in the aftermath of the improper sacrifices that he makes. The sacrifices that he makes that are not everything they could be, they're not in the service of the highest good, that are deceptive and arrogant simultaneously, because when we make improper sacrifices, we believe in the deepest part of ourselves that we've pulled one over God. And I suggest that that's a temptation you might want to avoid, that presumption. And then you might say, well, if you're tempted to aim down, you're tempted to make improper sacrifices, you're tempted to arrogantly presume that you are going to get away from it, with it, that you're not going to be called on it. What are the pathways down that might manifest themselves in front of you? And I think the two stories that follow the story of Cain and Abel detail that. So after Cain and Abel comes the flood. And that's no accident. The narrative placement of those stories is definitely no accident. It's unbelievably sophisticated from a literary perspective, a philosophical perspective, theological perspective, existential perspective. One form of temptation is the nihilistic chaos that's symbolically represented by the flood, right? It's the proliferation of sins. And sin is a word, both its Greek and its Hebrew derivation are related to archery. So the Greek derivation, I hope I haven't got this wrong, because I know there are Greek scholars in this audience. So the word is derived from the Greek word hamartia, which means to miss the mark, and it's an archery term. It's a lovely notion to know that, because to sin, therefore, means to miss the target, which implies that it has something to do with aim or the lack thereof. I love that. I think it's so apt. And the derivation of the word sin from the Hebrew source actually relies on the same imagery. And so to sin is to aim wrong or to miss the mark. And there's a variety of ways you can miss the mark, right? Don't aim at all. That's a good one. Assume there is no such thing as aim. Assume all aims are equal. Well, you sin, you miss the mark. What can happen? Well, one way is you can descend into a kind of nihilistic hopelessness. And that's not... You can understand that. You know, you meet people in life whose lives have been so hard. You know, you hear their stories. They've suffered so much, and they're bitter, and they're hurt, and they're resentful. And you think, oh my God, it's no wonder you're bitter and hurt and resentful. I mean, look what you've gone through. But you also notice that their bitterness and their resentment and their hopelessness and their chaos and their anxiety, it's not helping, right? It's worsening the problem. It's not making it better. And I'm not saying that people can always resist that. But I have certainly seen that it's not helpful. But I've also met other people, you know, who have had stories equally catastrophic, sometimes more catastrophic, sometimes so catastrophic you can't even believe that they survived, who are not embittered or made resentful by those experiences, and who continue to aim up. And so that makes a mockery of a kind of casual determinism, right? Is that you end up chaotic, nihilistic, hopeless, anxious, etc., merely as a consequence of the unbearable tragedy of your life. Because if that was the case, then everyone who had a series of unbearable tragedies, which, by the way, will be almost all of us in one way or another at one time or another, would end up in that catastrophic chaos that if manifested broadly enough in a society, produces a flood that ends everything. And that's the story of Noah in large part. And Noah, you know, he's wise in his generations was a lovely phrase, because it means for his time and place he was a good man. And that's a lens through which history might well be viewed. You know, we're very presumptuous as moderns. We look back and we think, well, you know, this person who did all these remarkable things said these things that we now regard as inappropriate and therefore can be dispensed with. It's like, well, what makes you think that you're above that criticism 100 years from now, that, you know, the best you can do is to be as good as you can in your time and place, and if you can manage that, well, good for you. If you can transcend that, well, then maybe you're some sort of saint, and you're probably not. So aiming at just the first is not such a bad upper aim.
First of all, I do believe that I don't think science is possible outside of an encompassing Judeo-Christian ethic. So, for example, I don't think you can be a scientist without believing as an axiom of faith that truth will set you free, or that will set us free. So we don't know the conditions under which science is possible, you know, and we tend to overestimate its epistemological potency. It's only been around, I mean, you can stretch it back to the Greeks if you're inclined, but in a formal sense, it's only been around for about 5 centuries, and it's only thrived for a very short period of time. And it's perfectly reasonable to assume that there were particular preconditions that made its rise and ascendancy possible.
It is a historical phenomenon.
Yes.
It happened at a specific moment in time.
Right, and at least
So
in
you say,
principle
what are the
for particular
conditions?
reasons. Yeah, and I think one of the conditions, well, there's a bunch of them. One is, for example, there's an intense insistence in the Christian tradition that the mind of God in some sense is knowable.
Yes.
So we could say, well, the structure of the cosmos, and you have to believe that that's the case before you're going to embark on a scientific endeavor. You have to believe that there's some relationship between logos, logic, let's say, but logos is a much broader concept than logic, that's for sure. You have to believe that there's some relationship between that and the structure of the cosmos. You have to believe that the pursuit of truth is in itself an ethical good, because why would you otherwise bother? You have to believe that there is such a thing as an ethical good, and those are not scientific questions, which is why I think the arguments of people like Hitchens are weak. It's like, yeah, Hitchens, Dawkins, people like that, they have a metaphysic, which they don't know, and they assume that metaphysic is self-evident. It's like, well, sorry guys, it's actually not self-evident, and they assume that it can be derived from the observations of empirical reality, and the answer to that is no, there's going to be axioms of your perceptual system that aren't derivable from the contents of your perceptual system. And you might think, well, that's not very scientific, and I would say, well, take it up with Roger Penrose and see what he thinks. Because I just talked to him for like 3 hours partly about this topic, about, say, the role of consciousness and the structure of consciousness. And it's by no means obvious that the materialist reductionists have the correct theory about the nature of consciousness. And not surprisingly, it's like we don't understand the relationship between consciousness and being at all. And so these
are hard questions.
Well, they're the hard question for consciousness researchers is why is there consciousness? Rather than why aren't we just unconscious mechanisms acting deterministically? They call that the hard question. I don't think that is the hard question. I think the hard question is what's the relationship between consciousness and being itself? And because I can't understand what it means for something to be in the absence of some awareness of that being. So when we say being, there's an awareness component implicit in the idea of being itself. So consciousness is integrally tied up with being in some mysterious manner. And I also don't believe that the most sophisticated scientists are by necessity reductionist materialists. Like, get as far as you can with that, no problem. It's Occam's razor clear. If you can reduce and account deterministically, no problem. But don't be thinking that accounts for everything, because I don't think there's any evidence that it does. So imagine that you're in Amsterdam during World War II, and the Nazis are everywhere, and you have a Jewish family in the attic, and you're up there with a baby, and there's 25 Nazi officers on the ground floor, and the baby starts to cry. Do you smother the baby? You save all the people upstairs. And Claire, who was a mother of a very young child at that time, said her response was, "Don't ask me such stupid questions," which I think is actually the right response. And it's more embodied response, right? And you can trap your philosophical cognition into weird corners, but that doesn't mean that your fundamental intuitions are flawed.
Yeah, this is right.
With this Nozick thing, it's like, well, if you could not have a body, it's like, yeah, no, you're grounded out in the world.
That's the rejection of Derek Parfit, right? So Derek Parfit's entire moral theory is the trolley problems, and you can decide how morality is constructed based on trolley problems, and people are like, well, that's not really how morality is constructed. It's not all based on edge cases,
it's not really how it's constructed at all. It has to be embodied, for example, and that's a crucial issue. And so the notion that
a set of semantic philosophical propositions, even coherently organized, constitutes the ethical world, and that ethics is top down from the semantic space into the embodied space. There's some truth in that because there's feedback loops, right? We think about ethics, and we can move around the edges of ethics and so forth, but it's within a game that's already established. And that game is actually established through embodied negotiation first. So when you see Moses leading his people through the desert, they're all fighting and scrapping away, right? And then he sits as judge of them for a very long period of time. It's months or years even, so much that his father-in-law says, you have to stop doing this because it's exhausting you, right? It's after that he receives the revelations from on high. And so my sense of that psychologically is it's a story about the fact that morality is encoded in our behavior in a deep level. And so deep we actually don't understand the morality. But then now and then we get an imaginative insight into the moral pattern. And then we get a semantic representation of the imaginative insight, and that's this revelation. It's like, here's a moral rule. It's like wolves suddenly becoming semantically conscious of the authority relationships in their pack.
Oh, that's really good. I like that a lot. That's quite good.
Like 20 years to pick up, so put a lot of effort into that.
Yeah, no, there's a big kind of rich debate in Jewish philosophy over whether Moses is right to listen to Jethro. So Jethro comes in and says you need to devolve authority to lower levels. You need the princes, you need the judges of the tens, and then the judges of the hundreds.
Which is a lovely way of thinking about it too, because they parse out I thought that's what should have happened in Iraq, right? Kill the tyranny. Well, what do? You have to establish a hierarchical local authority.
Yeah, exactly. So Jethro,
centralized control doesn't work.
But one of the big questions is whether in doing that, is Moses setting the stage for all of the chaos that follows? Because once you give up the authority that he has, the direct authority, and you have now layers of authority below him, how much authority can you devolve to layers below you without giving up the prime authority at the top? Right?
That is like one of the cardinal questions of life, isn't it? You know, if you have a family, you want to devolve authority and facilitate autonomy. And the question is, how much can you do that without generating disunity? And I would say it depends on the value of the goal that unites you. And then that brings up another question, and this is a question I would say for the moral relativists. I was talking to Rupert Sheldrake in Cambridge. He has lots of wild ideas, but I was conducting a seminar there on the nature of the uniting ideal. So it was imitation of the divine ideal. So you need a higher order aim to unite subordinate drives, right? So the question then is, what becomes the highest order ethic?
Right.
It's like the pyramid with a gold cap on the top, or the Washington Monument with a pyramid on top of it with this aluminum cap on. Something's at the top, and the thing that's at the top is actually qualitatively distinctive from all the things that are subordinate to it. So the question is, well, what's that highest order uniting principle? And, well, one answer to that the three religions that are based on books have proposed is it has something to do with the authority of the word. And Christianity, that's developed into the notion of the divine word. And you see that saturating Judaism as well. And that's at least in part because the thing that has to be superordinate is freedom of, it's not freedom of thought exactly, it's more like freedom of consciousness, because logos isn't thought. It's not logic either. It's much broader than that. It's more like consciousness itself. And the reason I think that's true technically is because imagine that consciousness and attention are in some sense isomorphic, right? I mean, when we pay attention to something, we become conscious of it.
Okay.
Consciousness is the mechanism that generates proximal solutions and dissolves and regenerates them. And so all the proximal solutions have to be made subordinate to respect for the process that generates all the...
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Makes sense.
I think it's a cardinal presupposition of psychotherapy, because what you do in psychotherapy is you allow people maximal freedom of expression, right? You don't impose your views on them. Even the Freudians use free association. Say whatever comes into your mind, and it turns out that that process of untrammeled expression in good faith is actually curative. It actually makes people better. It leads them to what they're afraid of. That's one of the consequences of free speech, right? Because you tend to circulate around what bothers you and what disturbs you, and so untrammeled freedom of expression will lead you to the source of your fears, and then you can confront those fears, and then in confronting them you can get more courageous. That's all part of it.
the other thing that ideology does, and the radical leftists are also very good at this, is that it provides you with a convenient locale for the existence of evil. And so if you reflexively identify the patriarchy with evil, well, first of all, that's a powerful idea. It independent of its broad merit. It's true. Now, it's not the only truth and it's not the complete truth, but it's true. The reason it's true is because every hierarchical system tends to degenerate in the direction of power. And all hierarchical systems are less than they could be. And that's partly because of the possibility that power and deceit will corrupt them, but also partly because we're willfully blind and deceitful in our own personal lives. And so when you tell young people that the cause of the trouble they see around them in the world, and maybe even the disquiet in their own heart, is the malevolent inadequacy of their society, that rings true. And they don't hear the rest of the story, and it's the rest of the story that I've been trying to tell. They don't hear the story that, don't forget about the evil and corruption that exists in your own heart. And don't forget about the fact that nature, this wondrous goddess as portrayed by the anti-human environmentalists, and by that I don't mean all environmentalists, by the way, that wonderful goddess nature is also trying to make you ill and kill you at all times. And so, but the story that corruption exists in hierarchical structure and that's a consequence of malevolence, the malevolent use of power and deceit, that's true. So it's very motivating, especially if you're young and you're looking for an adventure. Now, it's also too convenient, which is one of its tremendous dangers, because unless you're taught to look within and identify the malevolence there as the primary moral obligation, then you now have an excuse and a moral justification to take out all of your negative emotion, your hostility, your resentment, everything about you that's unexamined on the demonic enemy. And of course, that degenerates with extraordinary rapidity, as we've seen over and over and over. So it's up to the centrists on both sides to deal with this. I've been talking to a lot of the optimist rationalist types on my podcast, Matt Ridley and Bjorn Lomborg and Haidt and Pinker more distantly, but more recently Lomborg and Ridley and Marian Tupy, who's written a lovely book on human progress, 10 things everyone needs to know about human progress. It's something like that, huh? Anyways, one of the things we discussed consistently was the difficulty in promoting the message that all three of these men are very aware of, which is that from a material perspective, in terms of absolute privation, worldwide, humanity is way better off on virtually every dimension you could possibly measure than ever. And most of that improvement has occurred in the last 40 years, and it's been revolutionary in its speed. And no one knows this. And so it's very important to try to think through why that is. Like, that's such a positive message. Now, I talked to Russell Brand about this, and I'm bringing him up for a reason. He's a lefty by temperament and by heart. And his first objection, but he's very thoughtful and quick. His first objection, I pointed out all this data showing that by every possible objective measure, everything is way better than it was certainly 100 years ago, but certainly even 20 years ago, even on the environmental front in the main. And he said, well, what about disparity of distribution? So there's the problem of absolute level of wealth, let's say. That's improving. But there is still tremendous disparity. And of course, that is fair enough. You could even point out that the role of the left is to provide a conscientious voice for that's constantly attending to the fact of continuing disparity regardless of absolute level of wealth. And fair enough, but having said all that, it's a great mystery that incremental optimism is not sufficiently motivating. And you can't just wish human nature is going to change. It's not going to change. We got to tell a better story. And I also think that's why I'm a target. I think, is because I am actually trying to tell a better story and I'm actually having some success with it.
I think faith is a form of courage. You know, if you're hurt by life, and you will be, it's understandable that you might react in a nihilistic and hopeless fashion and become anxious and depressed and cynical and bitter and all of that. That's a bad pathway. And I think part of what helps you through that is faith. And part of that faith is that it's incumbent upon you, and actually in your best interest and everyone else's, to maintain faith in the fundamental goodness of existence, including your own, despite the evidence to the contrary. Right? Because you can draw conclusions from suffering in two ways, right? One is that you have a duty and perhaps the capability to transcend the suffering and still serve the good, or you can derive the conclusion that life is so unbearable that it would be best terminated, which is the conclusion that Goethe's Mephistopheles derives, for example, in Faust. He says, well, the world is rife with suffering, and it's so unbearable that consciousness itself, all beings should cease to exist. That would be better. Nothing is better than something if something is rife with suffering. And you can derive that conclusion, and you'll be driven to it in some of the farther reaches of your life when terrible things happen to you. But I would say faith is the courage to not take that path despite the evidence that that might be justified. And so I think it is a form of courage in the highest sense. And I also think it is a redeeming form of courage. One of the things I told my daughter, who was very, very ill for a very long period of time and in tremendous pain and suffering the high probability of continued slow, painful, inevitable degeneration, was do not let your illness, do not take advantage of your illness as an excuse. And I told her that when she was in grade 2. You know, it's no joke to tell someone that, because I knew she'd had every reason to be embittered. But I also knew that if she was, in combination with her illness, the two things might be worse than fatal. And, you know, if you don't think there are things that are worse than fatal, you have not suffered, because there are things that are much worse than fatal. And there's certainly not something you want to doom your child to.
So one of the things I've been talking to my audiences about is the relationship between responsibility and meaning, which is, what would you say? It's a constant refrain in the book. It's one of its underlying messages, let's say, or themes is a better way of thinking about it. You know, if you start with the presumption that there's a baseline of suffering in life and that can be exaggerated as a consequence of human failing, as a consequence of malevolence and betrayal and self-betrayal and deceit and all those things that we do to each other and ourselves that we know that aren't good, that amplifies the suffering. That's sort of the baseline against which you have to work. And it's contemplation of that often that makes people hopeless and depressed and anxious and overwhelmed and all of that. And they have the reasons. But you need something to put up against that. And what you put up against that is meaning. Meaning is actually the instinct that helps you guide yourself through that catastrophe. And most of that meaning is to be found in the adoption of responsibility. So if you think, for example, if you think about the people that you admire, well, you think about when you have a clear conscience first, because that's a good thing to aim at, which is something different than happiness, right?
A clear conscience is different than happiness.
Yeah, it's better.
Yeah.
That's
you're not
better.
Like guilting yourself. You're not feeling bad about yourself.
That's right. You feel that you've justified your existence, right? And so you're not waking up at 3 a.m. in a cold sweat thinking about all the terrible things that you've involved yourself in.
What you said to someone that you shouldn't have said, or how you acted, or lied,
what
or
opportunity you lost, or the things that you've let go that you should have capitalized on, and all of that. And so, if you think about the times when you're at peace with yourself with regards to how you're conducting yourself in the world, it's almost always conditions under which you've adopted responsibility, right? At least the most guilt I think that you can experience perhaps is the sure knowledge that you're not even taking care of yourself, so that you're leaving that responsibility to other people, because that's pretty pathetic. And unless you're psychopathic and you're living a parasitical life, and that characterizes a very small minority of people, and an even smaller minority think that's justifiable. But most of the time you're in guilt and shame because not only are you not taking care of yourself, let's say, so someone else has to, but you're not living up to your full potential. And so there's an existential weight that goes along with that.
I came about the ideas that I'm going to relate to you by a variety of routes. conducting investigations in a variety of disciplines. Scientific disciplines, to the degree I was capable of doing that, and inquiries into literary reality, because literature has its reality. I mean, not only its existence as literature, which is obviously real, but in what it portrays, which is very interesting because we all know that literary portrayals are fictional, and we all know that fiction isn't true. But we all know that literature is true, and deep literature is particularly true, and so that seems to pose somewhat of a problem. I came to the ideas that I'm discussing too because I noted the emergence of a problem across multiple disciplines, and it's a very serious problem. In fact, I would say it's a problem so serious that it took 3.5 billion years of evolution to solve. And that would be the problem of perception. You know, the world is given to us in our perceptions, and we confuse the world that we perceive with the actual world, and we have to because we're stuck with our limited and ignorant perceptions. And so it's necessarily the case that we bump up hard against the underlying reality that those perceptions are trying to represent. I read a paper in the MIT Handbook of Cognitive Science a while back. It wasn't the first place I'd encountered this idea, but it was stated pretty briefly, and so it's a good way of laying out the problem. The problem is really one of interpretation, and it bedeviled artificial intelligence researchers who were attempting to produce functional robots that could operate in real-world environments. And you'll note we have none of those yet, although we are getting much closer. It bedeviled cognitive scientists and psychophysiologists who were trying to understand visual perception, which turns out to be complicated beyond comprehension. I mean, we devote about half our brain, it's really more than that, to just seeing. And it's interesting to contemplate why that might be if the world, in some sense, is given and composed of self-evidently apprehensible objects, which it's not at all. And the problem also emerged in literary criticism, and interestingly enough, its emergence there sparked, I would say, the culture war that we're all engaged in at the moment. And so this is not a trivial problem. And the MIT researchers that I described, Medin and Aguilar, said, it is possible to categorize a finite number of objects in an infinite number of ways. And you think, well, that doesn't sound like too serious a problem. But it's actually a really serious problem because it means that any snapshot of reality, let's say any visual snapshot of reality, certainly any conceptual snapshot of reality, like a book, is subject to an unending number of potential interpretations. And we could perhaps quibble about whether that's actually infinite, but I don't think that's really matters. There's all sorts of mathematical discussions about the true nature of infinity, and that's not the point. The point is there are lots of them, way more than you could ever sort through. And so how do you do it? And how do you do it in such in a manner that really makes it simple in some sense, because there's the step and there it is, and I walk down it and no problem, except, like I said, it took 3.5 billion years to evolve the platform that made that perception possible. And so if it took God himself, 3.5 billion years to manage it, then it's a rather difficult problem to solve. So I started studying cybernetics, neuropsychology, animal behaviorism, literary theory, psychoanalytic theory, existential philosophy, biblical studies, physics to a limited degree, evolutionary biology, evolutionary psychology, measurement theory, construct validation theory, all these different diverse domains of inquiry, trying to triangulate this problem, although more than triangulate, because I was using more than one reference point. It's a good method by which to proceed. If you can find an answer that manifests itself in multiple historically detached disciplines simultaneously, it's some evidence that that idea is valid. You do that with your senses. You have 5 senses. If all 5 senses, which are quite qualitatively distinct, point to the same thing, then you can be reasonably but not certainly sure that it's there. And by reasonably but not certainly, I mean, if that was all there was to specifying the objects of perception properly, we wouldn't have to talk to each other and find out what other people think. But we do, because even with that quintangulation, let's say, we still orient ourselves unreliably in the world. What I think is at the core of the postmodern critique. I don't think you can look at the world except through a structure of value. And the English, and so you think, well, why is literary criticism so relevant? Well, or become so relevant and so powerful? And I think, well, I believe that we see the world through a narrative framework. And so that, if that's true, and we could talk a little bit about that, what I mean by that, I think you need a mechanism to prioritize your attention. And because attention is a finite resource and it's costly, so you have to prioritize it. And there's no difference between prioritizing your attention and imposing a value structure. Those are the same thing. And then I think that the mechanisms that we use to prioritize our attention are stories. And that means that the people who criticize our stories actually have way more power than you think, because they're actually criticizing the mechanism through which we look at the world. And so the postmodernists would say, look, you even look at the scientific world through a value-laden lens. And I think, yeah, you do. They're right. But what they're not right about is that the lens is one of power. And now, for someone like Nietzsche, the thing about a word like power is you can expand the thing, the borders of the word, to encompass virtually any phenomena you want. And so that's why I tried to define power as my willingness to use compulsion on you or other people. Because power can be authority, power can be competence. I don't mean any of that. I mean, you don't get to do what you want. Coercion. I get to tell you. Coercion, exactly. And I do think the Marxist types view the willingness to use coercion as the driving force of human history. And that's really saying something, because that means it's the fundamental motivation. And that's a very caustic criticism. And it's easy to put people back on their heels about that. You know, one of the things you see about capitalists, because I've been stunned to see the CEOs of major corporations like roll over in front of these DEI activists. I think, well, what the hell's wrong with you people? You know, you're not even making use of your privilege. And why are you, well, it's not very powerful if you're the CEO of a major corporation. You can't even withstand some interns who have DEI ideology. It's like, it's doing you a lot of good. And and why would you produce a 5th column within your organization that's completely opposed to the entire manner in which you do business and the capitalist enterprise as such? And one answer would be, well, we don't think much about ideas. It's like, well, maybe you should. And you know, you can be cynical about it and say, well, it's just a gloss to keep the capitalist enterprise going while appearing to meet, you know, the new demands of the new ethical reality, which I think is a bad argument too. But more importantly, it's that people are guilty. And the radicals who accuse us all, historically and as individuals, of being motivated by nothing but the desire for power, strike a chord, especially in people who are conscientious, you know, because if you're a conscientious person and someone comes to you and says, like a little mob of 30 people says, you know, you could be a little more careful in what you say and do on the racist front and the sexist front, etc., you're likely to think, well, I'm not perfect. I probably could be a little more careful, and it's no doubt that people have been oppressed in the past, and it's also no doubt that in some sense I'm the undeserving beneficiary of historical atrocity, and so, you know, maybe I should look to myself. And that's weaponization of guilt, and it's very effective, and it's not surprising, but it's not helpful. So, you know, so there's a resentment that drives this, like a corrosive resentment that's able to weaponize guilt, and it's very difficult for people to withstand it. Make friends with people who want the best for you. And that's a meditation on my own childhood and adolescence to some degree. I had friends who wanted the best for me and friends who didn't. And, you know, they were friends who some of them were aiming up and some of them were aiming down. And if you have a friend that's aiming down and you do something that's aiming up, then they're generally not that happy about it. They try to top your accomplishment with one of their own, hypothetical or real, or put down what you're doing, or offer you a cigarette if you're trying to quit and you've kind of done that successfully, or a drink if you've been drinking too much and are trying to stop being an alcoholic, or they're cynical and bitter and devoted towards no good. And sometimes that's family members too, and sometimes it's even part of you, But this chapter is an injunction to people, is like you have an ethical responsibility to take care of yourself, you have an ethical responsibility to surround yourself with people who have the courage and faith and wisdom to wish you well when you've done something good, and to stop you when you're doing something destructive. And if your friends aren't like that, then they're not your friends. And maintaining your friendships with them might not even be in their interest. And so it's a tricky argument to make, because I'm not saying, whenever anyone's in trouble, you should, push them into a ditch and then give them a couple of kicks. That's not the idea. The idea is that, but I had a couple of rules I didn't write about. One was be careful about whom you share good news with, and another was be careful about whom you share bad news with. And those rules ring in people's minds quite quickly. A friend is someone you can share good news with, You go to them and you say, hey, look, this good thing happened to me. And they say, look, I'm so happy that happened to you. Like, way to be. And they don't think, God damn it, why didn't that happen to me? And you didn't deserve it. Here's a bunch of reasons you're stupid and why it won't work. It's like, that's not helpful. And so I would say, if people are, the other thing people are doing, if they're trying to drag you down, let's say, is they're trying to see if you'll put up with it. Because they have this idea that maybe life isn't worth living and things aren't good, and that if they can besmirch, let's say, to use an archaic term, something that's pristine and good, then they demonstrate to themselves that there is no true ideal and that there's no necessary reason to be responsible and to strive forward. And so they use you as a test case. I'll just push you down into the low lobster bin and see how you respond. And if you put up with it, then yeah, my cynicism is fully justified.
Because you made it this far in a video, I want to celebrate you. Most people start and don't finish. Most people never actually follow through. Most people say they want something, but they don't ever do the work to actually get it. But you are different. You are special. Believe Nation, you made it here all the way to the end, and I love you. So as a special celebration, if you put a hashtag believe down in the comments below on this video, I will showcase you and celebrate you somewhere on the screen in a future video, because you are awesome.
For 10 more amazing rules from Jordan Peterson, check the video right there next to me. I think you'll love it. Continue to believe, and I'll see you there.
Pick something, aim at it. As you move toward it, you'll get wiser. Then maybe your aim will change. That's okay, but at least it'll change in an informed way. It's like discipline yourself in one dimension. See what happens. Well, that's exciting. And I think that's something